The following video was sponsored by EA and has spoilers to Dragon Age Origins, Dragon Age 2, Dragon Age Inquisition, and some of the pre-released materials on Dragon Age the Veilguard. Sections are clearly timestamped, and you can move back and forth at your own convenience. The memories of how it all began are lost. To time, to the quickening, to war. Perhaps only the Dreadwolf himself remembers. So much time has passed since those ancient days, when the elves of Elfhenan did battle with the Titans, and their leaders proclaimed themselves to be gods. When the great city of Arlathan reached high into the roots of magic and dreams. When the earth and sky were sundered by the Dreadwolf, and the Veil was born. And that is not to speak of the dwarves or the younger races, and the perils they invited and survived. The rise of Tevinter, the invasions of the Qunari, the ascendancy of the Chantry, and the emergence of the Blights. Much has been lost to the soot and soil, or conflict and time. Yet the greatest threat may yet lie before us, a gaping maw that threatens to swallow the world and all those within it. For the Dreadwolf has been revealed once more, and this time none within the lands of Thedas shall be spared the passing of what might be unleashed. Today we'll be exploring the world of Thedas in preparation for Dragon Age the Veilguard, as well as the many tales of the heroes within it. There are many of you who are taking your first steps into the world of Dragon Age, and if you're new here, it might be easy to get lost within this vast world and its lore. But don't worry. Take my hand, and I'll lead the way. Because the world of Dragon Age is so massive, we won't be able to talk in depth about every tale and legend here, but I'll be sure to cover all of what you're going to need to know if you're going to face the Dreadwolf. With that in mind, I'll be talking about both the ancient and more recent history of the continent of Thedas, the plot of each of the Dragon Age games, from Origins to Inquisition, and finally I'll give you all a look at the state of the world ahead of the challenge that lies before you. And as I said at the very top of the video, and as I'll give a second warning now, there are spoilers for all three games within this video. Many various alternate pieces of Dragon Age media might be mentioned or spoiled by proxy, and there are early previews of Dragon Age Veilguard in the final section itself. If you want to skip ahead or watch each individual section, I once again invite you to refer to the timestamps below in the description. But there's a lot to explore ahead of us, so without delay, let us begin. As invariably as there are many peoples across the realm, there are many tales of what came in the beginning. The Andrastian Chantry would state that it was the Maker who first brought life into the world so long ago that none remember it, not even those that founded the Chantry. Perhaps the truth is written within the furthest reaches of the Fade or the deepest pillars of the earth, where lyrium runs like rivers over rock. But what we do know is that the land of Thedas was once an entirely different place, where there was nothing separating the realm of the waking world from the realm of the Fade, the source of magic, spirits, and dreams. It is here that our story truly begins, with the elves or Elfen of ancient times. Legends tell that they lived in great cities within the sky. Such was the nature of the world that the Fade and its magics were perpetually within their grasp. They did not, in fact, refer to the Fade by that name. To them it was known as the sky, for it was what lay above them, and their cities existed both here and there. The Elfen lived in harmony with their world and the Fade, but according to the ancient knowledge recovered from the Shattered Library, they sought to explore the world down to the stillest roots of the Fade. And so, some amongst the Elfen set foot upon the lands beneath them, and built great cities. They hoped to live in harmony with this new land as much as they did with the sky, even as it moved to its own unfamiliar rhythm. At first, the Elfen were filled with hope, but as the long arc of history would demonstrate time and again for the Elfen, such hope would not be rewarded. Their cities were shaken by quakes, and the Elfen were forced to contend with the Titans. As the Titans reshaped the world with their song, they had been causing the earthquakes that decimated the fledgling Elfen cities. So the Elfen went to war with the Titans, felling at least one of them and declaring victory. When they mined its colossal body, they found that its blood was lyrium, the raw mineral that links the mortal world and that of the Fade, a conduit of magic, a source of incredible power. With the Titans defeated, the Elfen had been left weary and lost. In such times, all people look to their guides and to their elders. In the aftermath of a war, these would be the generals who had led their people into battle. What began as respect turned into adoration, with 9 amongst the number of the Elfen being exalted above all others, until eventually their divinity was proclaimed. These 9, the so-called Evanuris, were all worshipped as gods, and for the most part, they embraced their supposed divinity. But with such power at their fingertips, these newfound gods would eventually learn the fullest and cruelest extent of their own power. As time went on, these gods would engage in the enslavement of their fellow Elfen, and would wage war amongst themselves. The immortal elves of the time could still be killed, and so, as the gods contested each other, thousands of elves died in their service. But not all amongst the Evanuris chose the path of tyranny. Mythal, the All-Mother, would often attempt to broker peace between the other gods, as she saw the carnage inflicted upon the Elfen people as a great and terrible tragedy. But there was also another whose actions would go even further. He has held many names over the many tales told of those ancient gods, most of which have been lost to time, but he is best known as the Dreadwolf, Fen'Harel. Much contextual information about this time in history has been lost to the ages. As such, our knowledge of these next events is doubtless incomplete and lacking context. What little we do know has been collected from the words of those who remain and the remnants found in the corners of the Shattered Library. It is hard to interpret all of these texts, but this is the most common interpretation. Whilst Elfen of today curse the so-called Dreadwolf, in the time of the Evanuris, he was one of the few amongst their number who disputed the divinity of the 9 great leaders. As such, if he mantled any divine aspect at all, it would be that of rebellion, though the later Dalish instead remember him more as a trickster god. His actions in this time of war and slavery led to a great slave uprising. The masses of oppressed Elfen would aim to strike down their harsh overlords. What Elfen legends that survive tell us that Mythal was then murdered by the Dreadwolf, but it appears that the truth of this matter is far more tragic. Disputing accounts instead reveal the reality of the situation. It was in fact the other Evanuris who committed this atrocity, and in doing so, they set their own fate in motion. In response to the murder of the All-Mother, Fen'Harel was compelled to strike at the supposed divinity of his fellow gods. The Dreadwolf acted, banishing the other Evanuris back into the Fade. To prevent their return, Fen'Harel would then sunder the connection of the Realm of Dreams and the waking world upon which the Elfen had settled. This was the creation of the Veil, and it is arguably the most important event in the entire history of Thedas and the world, with perhaps only the rise of Andrastianism, the Qunari invasions, and the rise of the archdemons being as consequential. The Avanuris and their power was shattered, but the cost was far beyond reckoning, and this event would be remembered in Elfen legends as the Great Betrayal. Fen'Harel was the only Avanuris to remain fully on Thedas, and to see what his choice had created. The result was nothing short of the fall of the ancient Elven kingdom into utter ruin. Elfen cities, which reached skywards with their connection to the magic of the Fade, began to crumple in an instant and fall to earth. To this day, most of what remains of the ancient civilization is nothing more than scattered ruins. The Elfen would also suffer from the creation of the Veil. Before, the Elfen had been immortal and were connected to the ethereal magic of the Fade, but now the Elfen would see a change upon themselves and began to experience the sensation of aging for the first time. The Elfen would call this the Quickening, and though later generations of Dalish elves would claim that it was due to the arrival of humans in Thedas, the reality is that it was Fen'Harel who was to blame. For his own part, he fell into a great slumber after the Veil was torn down, and the Elfen people would retreat into the forests around their ancient capital of Arlathan. And in the wake of these ancient peoples, something else would rise, something equally dark and terrible: humanity. In the earliest days of human arrivals across Thedas, they were merely more than barbarian tribes. They might have remained a footnote across all of history were it not for the very human capacity of ambition. From Andraste's exalted march, to the rise of the first Ferelden king or the first Orlesian emperor, humanity's ambition would be its defining characteristic. The first human to change the face of the world with their ambitions would be known as Thalcion. Born to the northern human tribe of the Neromenian, he was the first of humanity's number to learn the art of lucid dreaming. By doing so, he explored the Fade and made contact with the spirits within. It was within his dreams that he discovered the first of the old gods, the dragon Dumat. In their lucid dreams, Thalcion and the other priests of the Neromenians perceived that these old gods inhabited a golden city in the Fade and believed them to be a source of divine power. Dumat and the other dragon old gods would become idols of worship for the descendants of the Neromenians one day. But even in the time of the first dreamer, his gifts were made readily apparent. Through Dumat's teachings, Thalcion learned to harness a terrible power that would grant humanity dominion over all of Thedas: blood magic. All magic is extraordinary, with mages of all those peoples who can wield such power drawing it from the Fade, but blood magic is different, and is instead fueled by the life essence and power of the blood of the living. Such terrible magic was beyond comparison in terms of power. With his newfound command of blood magic in hand, Thalcion went on to proclaim himself as the first king of the Neromenian, and his descendants continued to worship the old gods, making use of their newly gifted powers. In the times that followed, after a turbulent rise to power, a man known as Darinius would unite the northern tribes of humans into the vestiges of what would one day become the Tevinter Imperium. Records of the ancient Tevinter Imperium are scattered and subject to the perspectives of those recounting the history of this kingdom. But there are two factors that seem to be universally accepted. Firstly, the Tevinter Imperium's power was truly ascendant, and they came to rule over all of Thedas' surface lands, from the northern Anderfels to southern Ferelden. Secondly, their use of blood magic and the practice of slavery was at the heart of the culture of Tevinter, with their magocracy's highest-ranking magisters making use of their newly found powers as they saw fit. The Tevinter Imperium would eventually fall into conflict with the remnants of elven civilization and would see fit to invade what remained of the ancient forest capital of Arlathan. Where before it had fallen from the heavens, now Arlathan sank into the mud as the blood mages of the Tevinter Imperium fought the Elfen and conquered their lands. Taken in once again as slaves, the Elfen would see firsthand the cruelty of humanity, and would watch as humans claimed dominion over all the lands they had once controlled, and made all of them slaves. As time went on, the Imperium expanded the worship of the 7 old gods, and they formalized it as a true religion of the state. Dumat and his fellow old gods, Zazakel, Toth, Andorol, Urthemiel, Razakal, and Lusakan, would each be worshipped and attended to by a high priest. One day, the high priest of Dumat, a man known as Sethius Amladaris, started to hear the whispers of Dumat in his dreams. Dumat promised that if he could enter the Fade and claim the Golden City where the old gods resided, he would be blessed with apotheosis, ascension into godhood. Sethius, whose house was middling and imperiled at the time, lurched at the opportunity of divinity, and took on the title and name of Corypheus, the Conductor of Silence, and would follow the words of his lord without question. To accomplish this monumental task, he would need more power, and so he first went to his fellow high priest, known as the Architect. When the Architect consulted his patron old god Urthemiel for guidance, despite his own beliefs that ascending a mortal above the gods was blasphemous, he was told that he should assist Corypheus. Notably, if the Architect assisted Corypheus, Urthemiel promised that it would instead be the Architect who achieved divinity. As they went about assembling more power from the other high priests, each of them received a similar promise from their respective old god, until at last all 7 of the Magisters Sidereal were united in purpose. Together they looked to conduct a ritual of incredible power so that they might breach through the veil and enter the Fade to reach the Golden City. Doing so would require vast resources. A whole 2/3 of the Tevinter Imperium's entire supply of magically infused lyrium was required, as was the sacrifice of hundreds, if not thousands of slaves to fuel the mage's blood magic. What happened next is subject to much interpretation and is lost in some regard to legend. The teachings of the Chantry imply that for the sins of trying to seize divinity for themselves, the Magisters Sidereal corrupted the Golden City and were cast out by the Maker. Whatever the truth of the matter really is, divinity did not await the Magisters. They returned from the Fade having seen not a Golden City, but a Black City. They returned changed and corrupted. They returned as the most persistent plague upon all the peoples of Thedas. They returned as the first Darkspawn. From here, the new threat of this terrible evil would seep into the lowest reaches of the earth. In the darkness below, the Darkspawn were hidden from the sun's light and would be able to fester and multiply. The Darkspawn today multiply through the horrific Broodmothers. In turn, each of them produces the respective Darkspawn that is associated with its former species. Humans become Hurlocks, dwarves become Genlocks, elves become Shrieks, and the great Kossith, now known as the Qunari, become the terrible Ogres. Wherever the Darkspawn go, they spread blight, an infection that impacts anything that lives. Along the land itself where the blight is found, crops will not grow, animals will become more aggressive, and children are born smaller and weaker. The objectives of the Darkspawn are still truly unknown to the civilized people of the world, but as best anyone can tell, all they ever hope to do is spread carnage and death throughout the world. But there is something more to the behavior of the Darkspawn. Within their minds, they can all hear the call which sends them down into the deep, within the darkest parts of the world, below where even dwarves dare to tread. They are eternally searching and following this call until they find something truly primordial. After the first Darkspawn were created and returned to the world, it would not take long for the source of the call to be revealed as the old gods of the Tevinter Imperium. Each of these massive dragons lay buried deep beneath the earth, and the Darkspawn could hear their call. When the Horde inevitably discovered one such dragon, they would infuse it with their corruption. Thus it was with the first of the old gods, Dumat. Upon Dumat's corruption, he was no longer an old god. All old gods that are corrupted by the Darkspawn turn into something terrible, an archdemon, a dragon capable of leading and commanding the Darkspawn as a unified military force, not as some ravaging horde of aimless monsters. Thus, Dumat rose again. Thus, the first blight began. The tale of this great terror upon all the lands of Thedas might start with humanity, but those who suffered most at its hands would be those who lived below, the dwarves. Instead of inhabiting the surface, they lived deep within the stone of the very earth itself. They had not been born in the same way as elves and did not originate from the Fade. They had no connection to it, and would not be able to hear its magic. Dwarves, as a result, cannot become mages and do not dream, but their crafts and wealth are no less impressive even to this day. This was thanks in large part to their position underground, close to the majority of the lyrium deposits of Thedas. Being in proximity to this substance, which is normally incredibly dangerous, would give dwarves a degree of resilience to it over time, enough to allow them to mine it and trade it with the Tevinter Imperium above, and even old Arlathan in the days before humanity. The great dwarven cities, or taigs, were raised and would represent a prosperous empire made all the more wealthy by their trading partnerships with the surface peoples. But when the Darkspawn descended and awoke the first archdemon, the dwarves would be forever changed. Under the control of the archdemon Dumat, the Darkspawn turned from a mindless and savage horde of disunited monsters into an organized army capable of storming the whole of Thedas. And as they found themselves beneath the earth, the first to suffer their wrath, and those who are still at war with them even to this day, would be the dwarves. Even as the dwarves responded to the Darkspawn horde with new weapons, such as the terrible golems, they were overrun, and only a handful of their taigs would survive the onslaught of the Darkspawn into the modern era of Thedas. The great dwarven deep roads that connected their holds and created a single united dwarven empire fell to the Darkspawn as they laid claim to the great swaths of land beneath the land. Falling into disrepair, many of the taigs were separated and left as easy prey for the Darkspawn. Having conquered most of the subterranean kingdoms of the dwarves, the Darkspawn rose up all over Thedas and besieged the Tevinter Imperium across all its territories, north and south. The terrible ravages of this army from below would bring Tevinter and its citizens to its knees. Most pressing of all was the simple but devastating reality of facing the archdemon Dumat in battle. It might have been possible to slay the archdemon even though they were a dragon, but it would quickly reconstitute itself from the body of any nearby Darkspawn. Its soul would transfer into the soulless husk of any nearby creature within the Horde's multitudes, and would mutate it back into the form of the old god once more. Thus, the archdemon was effectively immortal. The situation was beginning to look desperate, with the Blight having endured for close to 2 centuries. But at last, a ray of hope would appear with the rise of the griffin-mounted forces of the Grey Wardens, an organization of warriors who accepted aspirants from any race on Thedas. These warriors discovered the secret that would allow them to slay the archdemons. Through a ritual undertaken by every initiate of the Grey Wardens known as the Joining, every one of their number would ingest a substance partially brewed from Darkspawn blood. This partial corruption was the key. If a normal warrior slew an archdemon, their reconstitution would take place as normal. But if a Grey Warden slew an archdemon, as the archdemon's soul attempted to merge with the body of the Grey Warden, a body that already possessed a soul, both would be destroyed. The Grey Warden that killed an archdemon would need to make the ultimate sacrifice, but their destruction would also ensure the destruction of the archdemon. And in the end, this was Dumat's fate. At the Battle of the Silent Plains, a massive combined army of the many forces across Thedas would join the Grey Wardens, and the archdemon was vanquished at last. After nearly 200 years, the first blight was over. The remaining Darkspawn became feral and routed, retreating underground, once again listening out for the call of the remaining old gods. There were still 6 of these great slumbering beasts that remained, and so whilst it was clear that the danger for the time had passed, there would be further blights in the future. Exactly 6 of them remained, 1 for each old god. In the aftermath of this calamity, Tevinter's territory was dramatically reduced in size, and it was unable to control its outer reaches within the Imperium. Thus, southern Thedas fell out of its grasp, and into such a power vacuum, a woman of conviction and courage would step to change the fate of the realm once more. After the defeat of the first blight, the ancestors of the people that would one day call themselves the Fereldans were beginning to establish clans in opposition to the loosened grip of the Tevinter Imperium. Amongst one of these clans, the Alamari, one day a woman rose to prominence, a woman who would reshape the fates of all the people of Thedas, just as Fen'Harel and Corypheus had before her. Her name was Andraste, and she was wedded to another tribal lord called Matharath. After she had been captured and was temporarily a hostage of the Tevinter Imperium, Andraste would begin to reflect on the suffering that she had seen others endure under Tevinter's might. According to the Chant of Light, it was after such reflection that she quieted her mind and received a vision from the deity that would become the most influential god in all of Thedas, the Maker. The supposed pleas made by Andraste to the Maker were simple. The Maker stated that he had turned his back on humanity for the sins committed by the Magisters of the Tevinter Imperium, for none should have the hubris to enter heaven believing themselves to be gods. According to Chantry doctrine, this was the reason the old gods were cast out of the Fade. This was the reason they would be found and resurrected as archdemons. Andraste pleaded to the Maker and asked for humanity to have another chance. And the Maker obliged. Andraste would go forth and begin preaching the word of the Maker and his tenets to all those that would listen. Her aim was simple: unite the whole of the world in worship of the Maker, and in doing so, redeem mankind in the Maker's eyes. This would be the birth of a new religion on Thedas, which worshipped the Maker and his chosen prophet, after which the faith was named Andrastianism. Her following would quickly grow within the southern realms of Thedas, and she would eventually mount the First Exalted March, a holy crusade that aimed to dethrone the cruel overlords of the Tevinter Imperium. Tevinter's power was already waning. The First Blight had only just ended, and there were numerous uprisings during that time against the old gods who had betrayed the Imperium. These uprisings would see disruptions for the Magisters who had led the world to ruin, and to the ruling societal class of Tevinter's mages. Andraste and her faith in the Maker would be found in the middle of this religious power vacuum at just the right time. Many slaves of Tevinter would flock to Andraste's cause and revolted against the Imperium. Amongst these rebel slaves was an elf known as Shartan, a great warrior who led his people in lockstep with Andraste and her husband Matharath. Despite the powerful mages of the Imperium, the forces of the First Exalted March would lay siege to the Tevinter capital of Minrathous at the Battle of the Valarian Fields. The siege was successful in the end, and the city was finally taken. It should have been the greatest victory for Andraste and her faithful. Instead, it precipitated the greatest betrayal in Thedas since the creation of both the Darkspawn and the Veil. For betrayal is the most bitter of things due to a simple fact. Inherent in its construction, it cannot be conducted by an enemy. You can only be betrayed by someone you trust. For Andraste, that trust would be broken by her own husband, Matharath. In secret, he went to meet with the Archon of Tevinter, a man called Hessarion. A peace treaty was brokered between the two of them to prevent further bloodshed as the Tevinter forces regrouped to crush the warriors of the Exalted March. Tevinter would give up much of its southern territory, including the domains now known as the Free Marches, Navarra, Orlais, and Ferelden. The people of these regions would live in peace under the new rulership of Matharath and his sons. The Elfen people who fought alongside those of the Exalted March would also be granted lands in the southern forests known as the Dales. Peace would be secured between the remnants of the Tevinter Imperium and the southern nations of Thedas that followed the word of Andraste. But there was a terrible price for this peace. Perhaps because he perceived her presence as a threat to the magocracy of Tevinter, Archon Hessarion demanded that Andraste herself be surrendered to his forces, or the peace would not be ratified. Andraste was one of the greatest religious leaders possibly in the entire history of Thedas. She stirred the hearts of warriors, of tribes and nations. She had united the peoples of all Thedas against the oppression of Tevinter and had even seen the walls of Minrathous torn down. She was Matharath's wife. And still, he agreed to give her up, forfeiting her life, so that he would secure peace and power. It is perhaps no wonder that in the recorded history of the Andrastian faith, Matharath is looked upon with disgust and revulsion. The peace accords were signed, and as was planned, Tevinter agents in plain clothes descended upon Andraste one day and captured her, bringing her to the Archon. Matharath and his sons claimed their new lands in the south, and Andraste was sentenced to death and burned upon a pyre. But in such a moment as the flames began to lick at her heels, history took yet another unforeseen turn, this time at the hands of Hessarion. The Archon was moved in the moment of Andraste's burning. The truth of whether Hessarion was acting with a pragmatic vision for the future of Tevinter, or whether he was genuinely overcome with regret and sadness, is a truth known only to him. The Chantry and its histories put forth the notion that it was the Maker himself who spoke to Hessarion, and who filled his heart with guilt. Regardless of what the truth was, the outcome is undisputed. Hessarion gave mercy to Andraste, plunging his blade into her heart, ending her suffering before she would need to endure burning to death. A decade later, the same Archon Hessarion would declare that the Tevinter Imperium, much like those lands that had risen up against it, was now to be a nation that believed in the teachings of Andraste. In this moment, he also revealed the treachery of Andraste's own husband Matharath, sparking a series of uprisings against Matharath and his sons. Matharath was killed by his eldest and youngest sons, Verald and Isorath, who were in turn betrayed in revolts. Isarath's wife, a woman known as Jashavis, would be the one to conduct the deed in the name of vengeance for Andraste. Only the middle son, Evrion, who had closely supported Andraste's teaching, was allowed to live. When he discovered the truth, he was overwhelmed with shame and voluntarily abdicated. Through the abdications or death of Matharath and his sons, the nations that had been subject to their rule would become independent territories in their own right. It was thanks to Jashavis that the kingdom that would be known as Orlais would begin to rise next. For their part, the Elfen rebels that had joined Andraste would begin their long march to the newly won lands of the Dales. These so-called Dalish elves were free, finally, to return to their old customs, but centuries of enslavement under the rule of Tevinter's Imperium had left their culture all but obliterated, and thus it was both poorly understood and poorly remembered. With what context of cultural elements, such as the true nature of their elder gods, having been lost to myth. Regardless, they persisted and constructed their new city, Halam Sharal. The Elfen were keen to ensure that they would never be slaves to man again, and thus the Order of Stag-Riding Emerald Knights was founded. But once again, their human neighbors would one day see their ambition overwhelm the possibility for elven freedom. And this time, it was in Orlais that another human would rise to change the fate of the world, like Andraste before him. His name was Cordillus Drakon, the first Emperor of Orlais. At the time of Cordillus Drakon's birth, Orlais did not exist, but a young man in that time rose with a dream. Drakon I supposedly dreamt that Andraste herself appeared to him and told the young man that his purpose was to set out and unify all of Thedas under a single united iteration of the Andrastian faith. For only when all four corners of the earth sung with the Maker's love would the Maker accept his children back. And so Cordillus Drakon strode forth, and would continue to build what are considered the modern foundations of Orlais and the Theodosian kingdoms we see today. Drakon would go forth from the lands to the west and would unite the southern people of Thedas under the single iteration of Andrastianism that he was preaching. The majority of Thedas still follows this Orlesian interpretation of Andrastianism to this day. The Orlesian priesthood of the Chant of Light and the organizational structure which was created alongside them would be Cordillus Drakon's most lasting and influential legacy. This institution, this priesthood, which now holds more religious sway on Thedas than any other, would be known as the Chantry. With its founding, a new calendar was instituted, and the first year of the divine age of the Chantry's histories would officially begin. This is where the calendar used throughout most of Thedas's kingdoms today comes from, with every age consisting of 100 years, and being named at its beginning by the current divine of the Chantry. But whilst the Chantry's founding would bring many into conformity with a single religion, there were some who would not so easily fit into this Orlesian version of Andrastianism. In particular, there were the mages, who would suffer the oppression of the Chantry and its agents for many centuries still to come. Andrastianism taught that magic should serve for the benefit of man and should never be used as a tool to dominate him. There are many ways to interpret this part of Andrastian doctrine, but for the Orlesian Chantry, this led to the belief that mages needed to be hunted down. And in particular, it led to the rise to prominence of an organization known as the Inquisition, a group that was known to hunt down mages in the times since the First Blight. For it was mages in Tevinter that had brought about the Blight, and blood magic was used as a primary component in the dangerous process of summoning demons. It had also been used by the Tevinter Magisters as they had tried to commit that first sin of entering heaven. Knowing this, it might seem like the actions of the Inquisition were just, but one also has to remember that magical talent manifests itself arbitrarily in all peoples of Thedas, save for the dwarves. Mages who had never brought harm to anyone would be hunted down in just the same manner as those that conducted the vile rituals of magic that the Tevinter Imperium was known for. But amongst these tensions, there was a more pressing threat that was arising in the wake of Drakon's greatest triumph, a sickness that had found new flesh in which it could fester. For deep beneath the earth, the Darkspawn hordes were still roaming, and yet again, they had answered the call. They had found another old god. And so it was that out of the Anderfels, the second blight began, led by the newly awakened old god, now turned archdemon Zazikel, the Dragon of Chaos. Faced with the rising threat of the Darkspawn and the newly arisen archdemon Zazikel, any empire through any time in Thedas' history would see their mettle tested. In the case of Cordelis Drakon, the challenges of the Second Blight revealed that whilst he had followed his holy mission all his life, he was still a pragmatist at heart. Drakon would need to fight fire with fire. Inevitably, it would fall to a Grey Warden to kill the Archdemon, but the Darkspawn Horde needed to be opposed as well. So it was that the potential problem of the mages was turned into an opportunity. By bringing the Chantry, the Inquisition, and the mages together, Cordelis Drakon found a way to bring the power of the mages to the front lines of the battles of the Second Blight. Through much debate and deliberation, eventually a treaty was signed between all three, the Navaran Accord. The Accord mandated that all mages would live in the circles of magi within each kingdom, a society separate from the rest of Thedas. They would be released into the service of the nations of Thedas for specific purposes, and would return to the isolation of the circle when their time was done. A part of the Inquisition would also be reformed into a new organization within the Chantry, known as the Templars. The Templars would police the mages of the circle, and would bring known mages to live within it when they were discovered to hold magical talent. They were also responsible for hunting down apostate mages who lived outside the circle, and bringing them into line with Chantry doctrine under the Navaran Accord. Whilst it was inevitably another step down the road of oppression for mages, this was the bitter compromise that all parties could stomach for the time being. And it wasn't all terrible for the mages. Whilst some circles were openly oppressed by their Templar overlords, in other instances, they lived in luxury compared to the common folk, and worked alongside their Templar friends for the good of others. No two circles have the same stories. Such is the case with any people across any place. But for Cordelis Drakon, the most important victory of the Navaran Accord was his newfound power. The ability to augment his armies with the powerful magic users of every mage circle within the Orlesian Empire. His armies would now pose a greater threat against the Darkspawn. Drakon also looked to secure the allegiance of others throughout Thedas in his fight against the Second Blight. Of those who notably declined to help were the Dalish Elves. They had seen Drakon's rise across the southern reaches of Thedas. In that rising authority of Orlais, the Elves could perceive an echo of history, something similar to the rise of the old humans of the Tevinter Imperium, the same Imperium that had enslaved them long ago. The Dalish severed diplomatic ties from the Kingdom of Orlais and went into isolation. They didn't know it at the time, but both the elves and humans were set to repeat the tragedies of the past in the not-so-distant future. But where the Elfen refused to assist Drakon I, there was one organization that had to answer the call, regardless of their beliefs, and that was the Grey Wardens. The state of conflict against the Darkspawn had not changed. Only a Grey Warden could permanently kill an archdemon, so an alliance with the Wardens was critical. This would be a test of both Drakon's competence and his diplomatic skills, and in these respects, the first Orlesian emperor would be remarkably successful. So successful, in fact, that the Grey Wardens adopted the Andrastian faith. Before the Second Blight was ended, Cordillus Dracon I would pass away, but his legacy was strong enough that the armies of Thedas were able to fight off the Darkspawn horde. In the final battle of the Second Blight, a hero by the name of Corrin slew the archdemon Zazakel. It would still take nearly a century to achieve this victory, but in comparison, the Second Blight was almost half as long as the first. The time after the Second Blight's conclusion saw a great focus on the act of rebuilding what had been lost to the Blight. And so, only a few years after the defeat of the Archdemon, the Orlesian Chantry recognized the spirit of this effort that had filled the land and proclaimed the start of the second age of the Chantry's calendar, the Glory Age. Though not everything was harmonious in this time, particularly with the wider Andrastian faith, most of Thedas would rebuild, and for a time there would be peace, at least for most. Not everything was truly harmonious, particularly within the wider Andrastian faith. It had been the vision of Cordillus Dracon I and of the Orlesian Chantry to unify the whole of the world of Thedas under a single standardized iteration of Andrastianism. This was made particularly difficult by what remained of the Tevinter Imperium. After the conversion of the nation to the faith of Andrastianism by Archon Hessarion all those years ago, the clergy of Tevinter had interpreted many of the teachings of Andraste very differently. For one, their priesthood allowed men to participate, in direct contrast to the all-female clergy of the Orlesian Chantry. But the real cause of the schism between the two different denominations of Thedas's major faith was their differing interpretation of the use of magic. In the second verse of the Canticle of Transfigurations in the Chant of Light, it says, "Magic exists to serve man and never to rule over him." To the Orlesians, this meant that leaders could not use magic and that magic should be controlled, hence the creation of the Mages' Circles. But to the Imperium of Tevinter, where magic had been ingrained in the local customs for as long as the Imperium itself had existed, this teaching was interpreted to mean that magic should be allowed and was not a tool of conquest. It was instead something that should literally serve man, and that it should not be banned. This major religious difference led to the schism that sparked several conflicts between Tevinter's clergy and the Chantry of Orlais, with the Tevinter Imperium founding its own equivalent of the Chantry in the later years of the Glory Age. Tensions would rise between the two iterations of the faith, and there would be many exalted marches where the Orlesian Chantry would attempt to bring Tevinter's into line. Ultimately, as all wars are, these attempts at exalted marches on Tevinter were bloody and tragic. And yet, still it is not as tragic as what would happen next, with the Orlesian frustration with their elvish neighbours. The conflict that led to the destruction of the Dalish elfen capital of Halam Sharal was one that was stoked by hatred, but in hindsight, it seems that it could have been entirely avoidable. Tensions between the Dalish elves and the human kingdom of Orlais had been rising for a considerable amount of time. It all came to a head at Red Crossing, where a tragedy befell a pair of lovers, one human, the other elven. Festering hatreds led to an attack on the village, where the pair was located by a troop of Emerald Knights, who tragically were led by the sister of the elf in the loving couple. She slew the human woman that loved him, and the numerous townsfolk responded. Though they were weaker and not as well armed, they were far more numerous, and ultimately the Emerald Knights were slain too. The deaths on both sides precipitated a conflict between the Kingdom of Orlais and the Dalish elves. With this pretext for war established, the Orlesian Chantry would provide an excellent religious incentive to invade the Dalish lands. Namely, the Dalish elves worshipped the old elven gods of the Evanuris rather than the Maker. Uniting all the people of Thedas in the worship of the Maker was the chief concern of the Chantry, and so the humans of Orlais had a unique casus belli that could help to justify their war. At the start of the conflict, Elfen forces, however, would be the ones to make the first move, as they rode out in force and even successfully claimed land all the way from Halam Sharal to the Orlesian capital of Val Royeaux. But what the human armies lacked in skill and ferocity, they made up for in numbers. In time, the greatest enemy of the Dalish would become the steady attrition of their own ranks. When this became overwhelming, they were slowly forced back. The Orlesians would eventually besiege the Elfen city of Halam Sharal, and in the grim echo of history from thousands of years before at Arlathan, once again the forest capital of the elves was sent sinking into the dirt, and the elven people found themselves at the mercy of humanity. Halam Sharal would be captured and occupied. Some of the Dalish escaped and became nomadic peoples, roaming the wilder places of the earth in order to stay mobile and alive. Others were captured and re-educated into the faith of the Maker by the Orlesians. Their integration into human society was not a kind one. Many of the elves across all of the kingdoms of southern Thedas were forced to live in the slums of towns known as alienages, and many of them could only find work for half as much pay as an equally competent human counterpart. Such is the tragic fate of the elven people, who seem destined to see history's cruel arc forever turning to crush them. But this was the first of many wars in this period of time. As time pushed forward, first to the Tower Age, then to the Black Age, and then the Exalted Age, there were many exalted marches by the Andrastian Chantry of Orlais on the Tevinter Imperium, and there were also the emergences of the Third and Fourth Blights, which were put down far more efficiently than those that came before. Where the First Blight had lasted nearly 2 centuries, the Third and Fourth Blights took mere decades to contain. Unfortunately, in the time of the Fourth Blight, the symbolic griffins of the Grey Wardens were suspected to have gone extinct. Though this is not completely the case, as they would reappear later in the Dragon Age, 500 years later. In the Exalted Age, great change fell upon the tribal lands of the south. A man of the Elamari clans known as Calanhad Therin did what seemed to be impossible at the time. He united the many disparate clans of the south after his conquest of the fortress of Redcliffe. After this, at the next lands meet, a long-standing tribal tradition of the south, Calanhad Therin would be proclaimed the king of all those within a newly united land. Thus the southern kingdom of Ferelden was born, and the Therin dynasty would serve as its monarchs. Even if their rule and the assent of each monarch in the line had to be approved by the legislative power of the Landsmeet, for a time they would live in peace and would be the great kings of Ferelden. This was all the better, as they would be sheltered from the next scourge to ravage the world. This would not be the likes of Tevinter or the likes of the Darkspawn. Instead, this scourge would come from the north, as a tide of grey steel, horns, and black powder. But the signs of the force that would one day bear down upon Thedas were already written within the Blights. For the longest time, something had troubled those that fought against the Darkspawn. Whilst many amongst them recognized the Hurlocks, Genlocks, and Shrieks as former humans, dwarves, and elfen respectively, few had ever seen the creatures who had turned into the ogres. These creatures were reportedly a horned people who had created a colony to the south of Ferelden, a people known as the Kossith. But these horned creatures had not been seen on the shores of Thedas for a long, long time, and when they did return, they no longer called themselves the Kossith, and they did not return to the south to reclaim what might once have been their colonial territories of old. No, they appeared in the seas north of Tevinter, with weapons of fire, and aboard their massive dreadnought vessels of steel. This would be the emergence of the Qunari, a people who were not vested in a faith, but an ideology, the so-called Qun. The principles of the Qun manifested as an extreme form of communalism that required all to see themselves not as individual people, but as cells within the greater body of the Qun, each of whom had a purpose that needed to be fulfilled. The Qunari had come to enforce their way of life upon the people of Thedas. From their perspective, it was their duty that they undertook out of a strange sense of pity for the people of Thedas at large. To some, the ideals of the Qun were inviting, given that the Qunari were a truly egalitarian society who accepted all, and where the highest military leader, known as the Arashok, could be considered as an equal to the lowliest member of their worker castes. Equally, the Qunari were a people who had no care for concepts that we find essential to our day-to-day lives, from individuality to love. Even the act of procreation was performed purely as a function of growing the Qunari people, and the Qunari children were raised from birth by the Tamazrans, who acted as both teachers and mothers, but also as guides for the selective breeding of the Qun. The Qunari had set their sights on the people of Thedas and wished to enlighten them and integrate them into the ways of the Qun. But they were well aware of what they would need to do to accomplish this. They knew that some people would not be re-educated, and that some would not accept the Qunari peacefully or at all. So the Qunari prepared for war, and in the Age of Steel, with their fleet of armored dreadnought ships, they laid siege to Tevinter's northern island territory of Saharon. It was here that the people of Thedas learned of the terrifying technology that the Qunari had developed. Black powder, or gatlock weapons, adorned their dreadnoughts and made them formidable in naval and land battles. The power of the Qunari quickly allowed them to overrun the northern territories of Thedas, including Ravane, Antiva, and most of the old lands of the Tevinter Imperium. The threat posed by the Qunari was one that reached across all of Thedas and its many peoples. United for the first time in their history, the two chantries of Orlais and Tevinter would set aside their differences. As the Age of Steel turned to the Age of Storms, all Andrastian nations would march against the Qunari invaders in a series of 3 exalted marches. The first was a great success, and the second was a great failure. In the third, the people of Thedas sought aid from the Lomeran pirates, and with their ships and their assistance they were able to deal some damage to the Qunari, even winning a few major battles at sea. But even after these exalted marches, there was a problem. The Qunari were wiping out the soldiers of Thedas to the point that their populations were beginning to dwindle. The Qunari, who had a strictly controlled program of breeding, had no such issues when their soldiers began to dwindle. They would simply allow for breeding to occur, and their losses would be replaced. But back in the lands of Thedas, men who had gone to war and died were no longer able to return to their families and sire more heirs. And so the populations of Thedas's many kingdoms were beginning to dwindle to dangerous lows. With every generation growing smaller, the prosperity of the kingdoms, even their existence, would eventually falter. In the end, there had to be a compromise of sorts. The people who followed the Orlesian chantry would make peace with the Qunari triumvirate with the Lomeran Accords and their signing. The nations of Antiva and Ravane were returned to the people who had lived there before the Qunari invaded, and in return, the Theodosians recognized the Qunari's claim to the northern territory of Parvolan across the ocean from Thedas. But Tevinter's chantry had suffered much under the Qunari and did not sign the accords. They would continue their war, with the Isle of Seheron still being contested territory to this day. The Qunari might have retreated from Tevinter at large, but they had still suffered greatly and were seeking revenge. The authority of the Magisters had been challenged. For the people of Tevinter and for its leaders, this was no victory. This was simply another conflict, another battle in a long, grueling war. But there were some who were luckily able to evade the scourge of war at large, and those to the most southern reaches of Thedas were affected far less than all the others in the realm. And thus, it is here where our story turns next. For though the Qunari invasions would certainly have warranted a lot of concern if you were a Navaran or a citizen of the Free Marches, for those living in Ferelden, the threat was much further off and warranted a lot less concern. But this was not to say that Ferelden would be free of conflict going forward. There were several small conflicts that took place. In the wake of his rising unpopularity, the king Arland Therin would suffer a rebellion at the hands of the most unlikely of organizations, the Grey Wardens. Normally, the Grey Wardens placed themselves above politics, with the intent of being prepared to face the blights no matter the territory or temperament of the rulers of the lands in which they operate. But the Warden Commander of Ferelden, a woman known as Sophia Dryden, would break this age-old tradition as she made a play for power. She and her Grey Wardens would be evicted from Ferelden for a time after she was defeated, even as she bitterly held on and fought the final battle at her keep. Whilst the Grey Wardens would return in time to face the Fifth Blight many years later, it wouldn't be hard to speculate that there was lasting damage that extended from this decision. Even though it would be a few generations before the next Blight would emerge, the Wardens had lost much of the authority that they used to hold within the kingdom. When the Darkspawn next rose, it would not only be costly for the Wardens, but also for all of Ferelden. The Grey Wardens were mighty, but the Fereldans were able to defeat them. This would not be the case with their next foe. They would be overwhelming. By this point, the Empire of Orlais was considered the preeminent cultural and military power across all of Thedas, and so when Emperor Reveal Valmont the Mad turned his eyes on Ferelden and committed to an invasion of the neighboring kingdom, the Fereldans had to face a terrible foe. The reign of the unpopular King Arland had long passed, but the conflict that started in the Blessed Age would see the current king of Ferelden killed in battle. The next in line to the throne was Brandon Therin. But all Ferelden's kings needed to be confirmed by the Landsmeet, so that they knew they had the confidence of their Terns, Arls and Bans. And in the Landsmeet where Brandon should have been proclaimed king, he was unable to inspire the confidence of the lords of Ferelden. Many amongst the Landsmeet saw that he had no political capital, and instead would side with the Orlesian Emperor so that they might retain some of their lands and power when the conquest was complete. And so, for a time, Reveal the Mad conquered and annexed all of Ferelden. No Landsmeets were held. Many of the people of Ferelden saw their customs eroded, and the people were subjected to the practices of slavery once again. For 70 years, the occupation went on, with the Orlesians referring to the Fereldans as dogmen, a second-class citizen-type slur referring to the Ferelden love of the Mabari warhounds. But this would not last forever. History turns to human ambition, and once again human ambition would rise. For though they had tried, the Orlesians had not been able to stamp out the royal Therin bloodline. And as it happened, a prince from that line would rise, and would return glory to the people of Ferelden. Perhaps this should have been unsurprising to the leadership of Orlais. After all, Since time immemorial, the people that have occupied the southern land now known as Ferelden have had something of a rebellious tradition to them, be it the initial resistance they showed to the Tevinter Imperium or the first exalted march led by Andraste herself. Resistance is born in Ferelden blood, and the Orlesian Empire was far from the mightiest conqueror that the people of Ferelden had seen. Even though they had occupied the land since the time of his birth, the heir to the royal bloodline, Prince Maric, would seek to follow in the footsteps of his forebears and rebel against the foreign invaders. But in order to take back his crown and his kingdom, Prince Maric would need assistance, and he found it in his closest friend and confidant, Loghain mac Tair. He was not of noble blood, but the union between Loghain and Maric would be unstoppable. The bond of companionship that they held for each other was unbreakable. The Orlesian conquerors were pushed back by the people of Ferelden, led by these two great heroes. Maric's reconquest of his ancestral homelands was not the only event of great circumstance that year, though. A new age of the Chantry calendar was soon to begin, and the Chantry first believed that it was to be a time of prosperity, where the world could peacefully be united under the Maker's divine rule. They were ready to declare that this new time of the calendar would be known as the Sun Age, as a reflection of the ascendancy of the Chant of Light. But the world had other plans. Maric had other plans, and on the edges of the kingdoms of northern Thedas, something happened. The sighting of mythical beasts changed everything. Two great high dragons were sighted, which represented a return of this species from supposed extinction. Many thought that they had been wiped out at the end of the Blessed Age, as these beasts once roamed the sky in great numbers. Their return was seen by many in the Chantry as an omen and a portent of potential doom. The old magisters of the Tevinter Imperium had once worshipped dragon old gods, and under their tyranny, the world had folded. It was a dark omen, and the scholars of the Chantry moved to rename this new age as a reflection of it. The Sun Age would not come to pass. The time that followed would instead be known as the Dragon Age. The omens of chaos that these two dragon sightings seemed to herald would not take long to surface. In southern Ferelden and western Orlais, a change of rulers would bring about the steady end to the conflict that was initiated by the Mad Emperor. The new Empress of Orlais, Empress Selene, would ascend the throne and would agree to peace terms with King Maric. For his part, Maric would bring his kingdom together, but would also father an illegitimate child with an elven mage known as Fiona, whilst his primary heir and son Cailan would ascend the throne. His illegitimate child was smuggled away to Redcliffe. His name was Alistair, and his fate would be one of many that were decided over the course of the Dragon Age. In the fateful year of 930 Dragon, when Alistair had become a man, he had joined the Grey Wardens. It was also in this fateful year that the foretold chaos of the Dragon Age would first be realized. For as the kingdoms of the people above moved onwards with their lives, those things that dwelled below still hunted relentlessly. Deep beneath the earth, the Darkspawn were on the move once again, and it was thanks to the Architect that they would discover a source of their call. Once more, an old god was arisen. The old god known as Arthemiol, the Dragon of Beauty, was corrupted and became the Archdemon. Thus the armies of the Darkspawn began to assemble once more. Thus they rose within the southern reaches of the kingdom of Ferelden, and thus the fifth blight had come at last. And so it was that in this time a new generation of heroes had to step forth into the breach. They would, much like those that came before, leave the turn of history changing in their wake, and would stride forth into the world to claim what destinies awaited them. Like Fen'Harel, like They would be the ones to change the world of Thedas. For in the year 930 of the Dragon Age, as the Fifth Blight raged, our heroes made their mark. As with any mythic tale, the details are subject to the interpretation of those who both tell and hear the story. As such, there are a variety of possible outcomes within many of the Dragon Age games that have far-reaching consequences across many different titles. Where possible, I will tell what is considered to be the canonical interpretation of events, and in cases where it is not clear, I will give possibilities. In those instances where choices needed to be made and possibilities exist, I will see if I can give further context. Our story in Ferelden begins with the Grey Warden, known as Duncan, and with you. Your history and story is yours to decide. No matter where your tale begins, whether you might be an elf, a dwarf, or a human, your journey would inevitably lead you on the path to joining the ranks of that most noble order of protectors. And not a moment too soon. As our tale began, the Fifth Blight had begun in turn, and as the oncoming war was bound to claim the lives of many, your induction into the Grey Wardens would have to take place post-haste. From here on, you would be known simply by the title of Warden. But none of this would have occurred were it not for a chance meeting with an elite veteran of the Grey Wardens, Duncan. As swiftly as they had met, the Warden and Duncan would go to Ostagar, where they were to regroup with the armies of King Cailan and his trusted companion, Loghain mac Tir, the same Loghain who had helped to liberate Ferelden. They would also meet the illegitimate son of the former King Maric and Cailan's half-brother, a fellow Grey Warden known as Alistair. With Alistair at your side, you were tasked with heading into the wilds to gather Darkspawn blood, a crucial component of what was to come. It would allow you to become a Grey Warden, as part of the joining ritual required it. You were also tasked with retrieving various treaties that had been signed in ages past, which would allow Grey Wardens to requisition aid in the event of a blight emerging. Darkspawn blood would be easy enough to acquire. The Korcari wilds were teeming with Darkspawn, who were advancing ahead of the main host. But when the time came to search for the treaties, they were found to be missing. It was at this moment that a young woman named Morrigan appeared before you, and invited you and your companions to meet her mother, Flemeth, who had taken the treaties for safeguarding. Morrigan and Flemeth, as it turned out, were witches, and their place in the greater story of Thedas would not end at any point soon. Back at camp, you were the only one amongst the prospective Grey Wardens to survive the joining and the consumption of Darkspawn blood. With this accomplished, you would become a fully fledged member of the Order. The Battle of Ostagar was fast approaching though, and the Darkspawn threat was rising as they rallied into a greater force. Ferelden's Grey Wardens and King Cailan's forces were all gathered in attendance to do battle with the oncoming hordes. At the War Council, the Warden and Alistair were tasked with ascending the nearby Tower of Ishal and lighting the beacon at its apex. This would be the signal that Loghain needed to charge the Darkspawn's flank and help to win the day. Who knows what might have happened if all had gone to plan. Plans seldom survive contact with an enemy, but they never survive the meddling of a traitor. When Loghain saw the signal, he ordered his forces to retreat instead of charging, leaving King Cailan and Duncan to die, while the Warden and Alistair were overwhelmed by the horde. If it hadn't been for the intervention of Flemeth, all might have been lost. But as luck would have it, both the Warden and Alistair were saved by the Witch of the Wilds and awoke within her hut. The other Wardens and the remaining forces of the King would not be so lucky. The Battle of Ostagar had not been the glorious victory that King Cailan had envisioned. It had been a massacre, and the Warden and Alistair were two of the only survivors. Ferelden's armies would need to be replenished if the Darkspawn threat was to be faced again. However, not all hope had been extinguished yet. Thanks to the earlier recovery of the treaties, there was still the possibility for the various allies of the Grey Wardens to be called to battle. Dwarves from the underground kingdom of Orzammar, Dalish elves from the various clans that roamed the lands of Ferelden, mages from the Circle of Magi, and, potentially, any forces within the realm that might still be friendly to the Wardens could also be recruited. The Wardens would now have a heading, they would have a plan, and at very least they would understand that the battle against the Darkspawn was not completely lost. With Flemeth offering Morrigan as a companion to aid the Wardens, the group would set out on their quest to save Ferelden from the Darkspawn hordes. As the group departed, Alistair and the Warden would start to experience dark dreams of a terrible dragon. At first, it would have been hard to truly confirm for two younger Wardens, but at the time, they were hearing the call of the true leader of the Darkspawn, the Archdemon. Every blight since the first had been led by one of these corrupted old gods, whose draconic forms would dominate any battlefield and whose tactical command of the Darkspawn turned them from savage animals into an organized war host. And this time, it was the Archdemon Urthemiel that had been awakened by the Darkspawn. Urthemiel's recurring presence in the dreams of the Wardens would eventually confirm that this was truly the fifth blight. It would also grant the Wardens a vision of their destinies, both their purpose and potentially their doom. As the Wardens first dreamed of Urthemiel and made their way across the scattered landscape, Loghain was making a power play. Back in the capital city of Denerim, he presented his own version of events of what had happened at the Battle of Ostagar. He placed the blame squarely on the Warden forces, whilst also declaring that the Order was to be outlawed in Ferelden and that any survivors were to be hunted down. At this moment, as he branded the Wardens as traitors, he also declared himself to be the acting regent of all Ferelden. This move was met with shock by the nobility present. Many disbelieved his claims about Ostagar, and many also disapproved of his claim to the throne with no Therin blood. If Loghain wasn't stopped, the whole of Ferelden could be plunged into an internal political conflict, further weakening the nation against the advancing Darkspawn. Were it not for the Ferelden traditions and the use of a landsmeet to declare confidence and authority in their rulers, all might have been lost then and there. As it stood, the Band of Heroes had been bought critical time, even as Ferelden pitched itself towards civil war. To stop this fifth blight, the Warden and their allies would need to use treaties to secure the loyalties of those who could aid the Wardens. This would mean first heading to Lothering, where the Darkspawn army's advance had set the town into a state of utter chaos. Working through the chaos, the Warden would meet potential companions, including the Qunari warrior Sten and the Orlesian chantry sister and bard Liliana, before leaving the town behind for good. The town would be destroyed in the advancing wake of the Darkspawn. The group's onward journey would take them to many places: the town of Redcliffe, the village of Haven, the Magi's Circle of Kinloch Hold, the Brecilian Forest, the dwarven Tig of Orzammar, and the capital city of Denerim. Whilst you can conduct your Warden's journey in a number of ways, today, as with the stories of Hawke and the Inquisitor, I'll be presenting a path that is just one way in which the skein of fate might unravel. Alistair would recommend that the group return to Redcliffe, where he had been raised. The local ruler, Arl Eamon, would be able to render assistance to the group should they ask for it. However, upon arrival it was clear that the situation was going to be an entirely more complicated one. The town was beginning to suffer nightly attacks from undead. They had emerged from Redcliffe's castle, and the village below had been beset night by night. As it turned out, this was the result of the Arl's own son, Connor, who had recently manifested magical talent. Normally this would doom him to a life in the mage's circle, but the Jarl's wife had sought to hire a mage as a tutor who could teach him to hide his magical talents. This tutor was known as Joan, and he had unfortunately been a treacherous agent of Loghain. Joan poisoned Jarl Eamon, which led to Connor attempting to use magic to heal him. Unfortunately, Connor's attempts to heal his father had led to him being possessed by a demon. Deciding Connor's fate would either require great assistance from the mages or would require someone to die. This would be a critical choice for the Warden and would potentially send them to the mages' circle next. All the while, the Jarl still needed to be cured of his illness. To cure the Jarl, the Warden and their companions would need to recover the Urn of Sacred Ashes. The Chantry's famous scholar brother Genetivi had been working on finding its location for years now, but he was mysteriously absent from his home. Following the trail of evidence would eventually lead the group to the village of Haven. After recovering brother Genetivi, who had been kidnapped and held there, the group would press on to a ruined temple where the urn was meant to be held. It was here that the group encountered the so-called Disciples of Andraste, a mad cult that worshipped a high dragon, believing it to be Andraste reborn. After either combating the cult or carefully conducting diplomacy with them, the Warden and their team were able to reach the urn and recovered enough of its ashes to heal the Jarl. But if Connor still lived, his demonic possession would still need to be dealt with before the Jarl could even be approached. Yet again, the choice either involved death or greater assistance from the Circle of Mages. Traveling to the Circle Tower of Kinloch Hold, the Warden and their companions would find a scene of chaos. The mages had been embroiled in an internal conflict brought about by one of Loghain's agents within the Mages' Circle. This agent, an enchanter by the name of Uldred, had summoned demons and was using blood magic to control the minds of his fellow mages. After allying with friendly mage forces, pushing through the demonic threats within the tower and its many levels, passing through the Fade and the Nightmare of a Sloth demon, and destroying Uldred himself at the apex of the tower, the whole of the Mages' Circle had been cleansed of demonic taint. Thus, the Warden and their companions would need to make a choice. They could either secure the loyalty of the mages or of the Templars. This would depend on the Warden's judgment of whether the mages could be trusted to not turn to blood magic. Should the mages not be trusted, the Templars would enact the rite of annulment, and all the mages would be killed, freeing the Templars to march at the Warden's side. Should the mages be trusted, though, they would march to battle instead, and would be able to render assistance with exorcising the demon that was within Jarl Eamon's son, Connor. But deep within the Mages' Circle, Morrigan would discover something that would change her fate forever: her mother's black grimoire. Within its passages, Morrigan had discovered a spell that allowed the essence of one creature to inhabit the body of another. Morrigan discovered that Flemeth's intentions were also to use this spell to possess her body, thus allowing Flemeth to extend her own life at the cost of Morrigan's. As it turned out, Flemeth had been doing this for thousands of years, unlocking the secret to becoming effectively immortal. Morrigan would entreat with us to kill Flemeth, so that the same fate would not befall her. Regardless of whether the Warden carried out this choice or not, Flemeth would survive, and her plans would continue to unfold into the future. With Connor's demonic possession having been ended by either death or by the mages, and with the ashes of Andraste having been put to use, Jarl Eamon would finally awaken. He would propose the plan of calling a Landsmeet to address the question of who might rule Ferelden. This would allow the Wardens to take the fight to Loghain politically, and to reunite Ferelden against the Darkspawn threat. The Landsmeet would occur in time, but in the meantime the Warden would need to secure the loyalties of others to combat the Darkspawn. This would lead them and their companions to the Brecilian Forest, where they would seek the support of the wandering clans of the Dalish Elves. Unfortunately, As the group would soon discover, the Dalish clans in the forest were being assaulted by a pack of werewolves. The keeper of the Dalish elven clan, known as Zathrian, would refuse to offer the warden aid until the werewolf threat had been dealt with, lest his people should be left undefended. But of course, not all was as simple as it appeared. The werewolves appeared capable of speech, and whilst they would attack the party at first, they would also communicate, telling them to leave. The closer the warden and their allies got to the werewolves' lair, the more the wolves retreated from the fight. As it turned out, the werewolves were once humans and had been cursed by Zathrian as an act of vengeance against humans who hundreds of years ago had attacked his own children. The perpetrators of these crimes were long dead, but the curse had persisted. In the push to end the curse, the warden and their allies would need to side with either the Dalish elves and Zathrian, or the werewolves and the spirit of the forest that had taught them to speak. In doing so, they would forfeit the chance to secure the loyalties of the other group. Traveling deep into the earth during a Darkspawn invasion is not typically considered wise, but the warden and their companions would need to do so in order to seek the allegiance of the dwarves. Unfortunately, when the warden discovered them, the dwarves would be in the middle of a succession crisis. Not 3 weeks prior, the old king had died, and 2 potential candidates for the throne had emerged: the would-be heir apparent Prince Balin, and the respected challenger that the king had supposedly chosen as a successor, Lord Harrowmont. Neither dwarf was perfect. Lord Harrowmont was a respected lord of the Orzammar Assembly and was seen as a more honourable dwarf than the heir apparent, but also could have been seen as a usurper and held too closely to some of the more outdated traditions of the dwarves. Prince Balin, on the other hand, was the blood of the king and was seen as a progressive voice for his people, but he was also exceedingly ruthless and had killed or exiled his brothers to ensure that he would be the one to ascend the throne. Regardless of whether the warden showed favour towards Prince Balin or Lord Harrowmont, the warden would be sent to search for one who might tip the balance in the favour of either of the 2 potential kings, one of the last living dwarven paragons, a heroine by the name of Paragon Branka. She had been searching for the Anvil of the Void, the ancient piece of dwarven technology that had been used in the creation of their great war golems, at the cost of trapping a dwarven soul within each construct. This would be learned in a conversation with the Anvil's creator, Karadin. He had been sealed within a golem long ago, and had seen firsthand how the Anvil could be used for evil ends. Whilst Branka would see the Anvil preserved, Karadin would beg you to destroy it. There would be no middle ground, and therefore one paragon would necessarily have to perish. With the support of the surviving paragon, the warden would receive a crown to place upon the head of their chosen successor king. The crown and the support of the paragon that it represented would end all questions of succession, and the new king of Orzammar would begin to send their forces to assist the warden against the Blight. With all their potential allies gathered, and their calls for aid having been answered, the warden and their companions would return to Arl Eamon and ask for the Landsmeet to be called in the capital city of Denerim. Upon arriving in the city, it was revealed that the Queen was being held hostage by Loghain's most influential supporter in the Landsmeet, an Arl by the name of Rendon Howe. The Queen's personal maid, Alina, would be the one to deliver this news to the warden and would inform them of Howe's plot to murder the Queen and pin the blame on Arl Eamon to dash his chances of success against Loghain in the Landsmeet. In the process of trying to free the Queen, the warden would also encounter another of their order, an Orlesian Grey Warden by the name of Riordan. Riordan promised the warden aid in the coming Blight, especially seeing as there were only 2 remaining wardens within the whole of Ferelden. Thankfully, in all the commotion caused by the warden and their allies as they were rescuing the Queen, Riordan would be able to escape his cell and leave, to regroup with them later. There would, of course, be an inevitable confrontation with the Arl himself, and after his defeat there was nothing to stop the Warden from freeing the Queen. Nothing except a highly armed contingent of Loghain's men, that is. This would either result in a bloody fight, the Warden's imprisonment, or potentially both. Morrigan would entreat with us to kill Flemeth, realizing that she was not the first of Flemeth's daughters to have perished in this way, as the Witch of the Wilds had supposedly lived for hundreds of years. Regardless of whether the Warden carried out this choice or not, it would appear that Flemeth would survive, in no small part due to the actions of the Hawk. Morrigan, for her part, would be able to use the spell she discovered for her own devices. She would be able to conceive a child with one of the Grey Wardens and use this spell to force the Archdemon Urthemiel to inhabit it instead of any Grey Warden that might slay it. The fate of the child would not be death. Instead, it would survive, freeing the soul of the old god within the child from corruption and ending the blight. Morrigan promised to raise the child in isolation with a respect for the terrible power that rested within it. But she had one final warning for the Wardens. She noted that her mother Flemeth's original purpose of putting her and the Wardens together was to conceive this child, and that her plans for the soul of the old god were equally unthinkable. Regardless of the choice that lay before them, the Warden and their companions would rally their forces at Redcliffe ahead of the final battle. The army, however, would be forced to speedily march back to the capital of Denerim due to the Archdemon and its armies being poorly scouted. They would make their way to the capital instead, and it would be there that the final battle would take place. Riordan was slain in the battle with the Archdemon at Denerim, but was able to tear part of its wing, forcing the great dragon to land at the top of Fort Drakon. This allowed the Warden and their companions to rise up to fight against it. In this titanic battle that claimed the lives of Ferelden's many defenders, it seemed like there was little hope. And yet, the Warden and their companions stood together. And at last, a killing blow was struck against the great dragon. As the death knell of the dragon sounded out across Ferelden's capital, a great pillar of light rose from Fort Drakon to confirm its destruction. With its death, the Darkspawn legions were left leaderless and routed. The Fifth Blight had ended. The Warden would go on to be remembered from this day forth as the hero of Ferelden. But the tales of the Wardens of Ferelden would not end here. There was more still to be done. 6 months after the Battle of Denerim, a strange new conflict was beginning to brew on the Amaranthine coast. A conflict between a pair of rival factions of Darkspawn. Either the surviving Warden or a new Grey Warden commander would rise out to face off against these two factions. One was led by a broodmother that was known only as the Mother, a broodmother who had gone mad. The other was led by a shadow from history, the Architect, one of the 7 high priests of the Magisters Sidereal who had originally attempted to enter the Golden City and had failed. When the Warden confronted the Architect, he proposed a plan that would seem abominable. The Architect revealed that he had been experimenting with Warden's blood, and that using it, the Darkspawn beneath him could be granted intelligence and self-control. It was the belief of the Architect that this would be a remedy to the Blight, which not only ravaged the forces of the world above, but also the numbers of the Darkspawn. The Architect would see them become a people unto themselves, with the ability to choose their own future. However, the question of trust was an obvious one. The Architect was one of the oldest Darkspawn, the most powerful emissary that they had ever seen, and it was later revealed by the Mother that the Architect was in fact to blame for the start of the Fifth Blight. He had attempted to prevent it by raising Urthemiel as one such intelligent Darkspawn with the blood of a Grey Warden, with self-control and free will. It had failed. The mother, it turned out, had also been liberated by the architect, and she had been driven raving mad by the archdemon's death. It would be up to the warden to choose whether to go along with the architect's plan or to slay him. Regardless, the crazed mother would need to die too. And finally, 1 year after the events of the Fifth Blight, the warden and their companions would pick up hints as to the whereabouts of Morrigan. At the final battle of the Fifth Blight at Denerim, as the archdemon fell, she vanished without a trace, not even saying as much as a goodbye. After the warden, or a warden commander, tracked her down, she warned that Flemeth was still alive, and that she was more dangerous than anyone had previously realized. No matter the outcome, Morrigan would eventually pass through an Alluvian doorway, one of the ancient elven gates that was connected to the crossroads. She uttered a single warning. Change was coming to Ferelden, to Thedas, to the world, and there was little that could be done to stop it. As she passed through the doorway, she left Ferelden to its fate, and the hero of Ferelden would pass into legend. But across the coastlands and the waking sea, a new hero was being forged, and a new legend was beginning to rise over the city of Kirkwall. Their path had also taken them from the small town of Lothering, but their journey would take them to new, unexplored lands with dangerous new foes. The figure that would one day come to be known as the Champion of Kirkwall would begin their journey fleeing the Ferelden town of Lothering with their family, as the Darkspawn invaded during the events of the Fifth Blight. Hawke and their family decided to seek refuge in the city of Kirkwall, where their mother Leandra had been born, and where their uncle Gamlen could be found. Kirkwall was their potential haven across the sea, but it was also known as the City of Chains. The city's history reached all the way back into the days of the ancient Tevinter Imperium, where the practices of slavery and blood magic ran rampant. It's perhaps hard to understand the extent of these practices within Kirkwall until one looks at the old Tevinter architecture of the city itself. In the labyrinths below the streets, slaves would be brought to be sacrificed in blood magic rituals. Channels built into the architecture and sewers would allow blood to flow ever downward, like carmine rivers, toward where the mages worked. This vile harvest was collected into entire lakes below the city streets, and the magisters and mages of Tevinter would build structures atop these lakes, within which they could practice their magic. The Tevinter magisters even worked to thin the veil around Kirkwall even further. It is thanks to this that a disturbing trend has been born. In Kirkwall, more than any other city in Thedas, it is far more likely for a mage to fall and become an abomination. Even when such dangers are not present, there is a greater demonic influence within the city, and more of its mages will indulge in the forbidden arts of magic. Even to this day, hundreds of years after the fall of the Tevinter Imperium from the height of its power, the echoes of its influence over the city can still be felt. It is a dark place, a dangerous place. But for Hawke and their family, it was also the only refuge they had. As they fled, the group encountered many Darkspawn, including one of the massive ogre monstrosities that would kill one of Hawke's siblings. After eventually defeating it, the group was surrounded on all sides by the Horde, and death seemed all but certain. But then, a shadow overhead ushered in a changing of omens, as a high dragon appeared and shattered the remnants of the Darkspawn from on high, burying them under waves of flame. This high dragon began to transform before the eyes of Hawke and their family, turning into an all-too-familiar figure, Morrigan's mother, the Witch of the Wilds, Flemeth. She cut a deal with Hawke and their family. In exchange for the guarantee of safe passage, all they had to do was deliver an amulet to the Dalish keeper in the Free Marches. Their family, having already lost one of their own, agreed with little meaningful hesitation, and so their passage was guaranteed, in no small part, due to Flemeth. When they did arrive across the sea, they found themselves at the gates of Kirkwall, and yet no one was being allowed in. The only reason they were even allowed to enter after days of waiting was thanks to their uncle Gamlen, who provided a less than perfect option. Hawke would need to work alongside their sister or brother, whoever was left, spending an entire year indentured to either smugglers or mercenaries. But within the space of a year, they would earn their reputation and would prove themselves to be a dependable set of hands in any situation. Within Hawke's time within the city of Kirkwall, they would meet many influential characters, from the pirate Isabella to the blood mage Merrill to the escaped Tevinter slave Fenris. They would also meet the former Grey Warden mage, Anders, whose opinion on the Templars and the freedoms of the mages would reach to fanatical lengths in the end. He would accomplish his goals, even if they might one day redefine the fate of all of Thedas. It should be understood at this first juncture that Anders was vehemently opposed to the Templars on account of the continual cruelties they inflicted upon the mages. The worst of these included a process called the Rite of Tranquility, which left mages without emotions and without their connections to the Fade. They were far less likely to be demonically possessed, but the cost of such a protection was terrible. They would no longer be able to practice magic, and perhaps worst of all, would never be able to dream again, living a hollow state of existence that could barely be called life for the rest of their days. A tranquil is easily identifiable. Their empty tone speaks to the dark truth behind their existence. Anders would fight against these tyrannical practices and fervently championed the mage's cause. He was also remarkable because he had agreed to be the corporeal host of a spirit known as Justice. This spirit acted exactly as its name suggested, and would actively possess Anders in moments where the oppression of the mages within Kirkwall was most pronounced and obvious. This spirit would also become corrupted in time by the suppressed anger that Anders held at bay, and would be morphed into a spirit of vengeance. The consequences of the bond of Anders and Justice would be a part of what reshaped Thedas, but it would take some time for these events to transpire. Hawke and their family would eventually find the Dalish camp at the foot of the Sundermount, and gave the amulet to the keeper as instructed. After a ritual conducted with the aid of the blood mage Merrill, Flemeth appeared before them, emerging from the amulet and informing Hawke that they had likely saved her life. As thanks for this action, Flemeth informed Hawke of a great change that would soon fall upon the world, and instructed Hawke to not hesitate to leap when opportunity presented itself. Flemeth then transformed back into a dragon, took flight, and left the party with only a cryptic warning and yet more questions. But the timing of this strange advice seemed all the more prescient. Only recently, Hawke had been hearing of a defining opportunity that could present itself to any that were willing to grasp it: an expedition into the Dwarven Deep Roads. It was shortly after the defeat of the Archdemoner Themiel and the Darkspawn of the Fifth Blight. The Horde had been left shattered and leaderless, and as they roamed about the surface, routed and disorganized, the Deep Roads were unusually quiet. There was practically no better moment to embark upon an expedition of this nature to explore them and look for lost riches. The nature of the Darkspawn presence had been greatly thinned and weakened. Now was the time when they could acquire riches of their own and change their fortunes. It was also at this point that they met Varric, a surface dwarf best known for his strange affinity to his crossbow that he calls Bianca. Varric was willing to inform them that to go on the expedition, they would need to present its leader, his brother Bartrand, with funding for it, in the form of 50 sovereigns. And so, after working odd jobs across Kirkwall, meeting their new allies and establishing the funds for the expedition, Hawke would go, but they would need to make a critical choice. Their mother was begging them not to take their sibling on this dangerous expedition. The choice would be a defining one for the Hawke family as a whole, its consequences far-reaching. In the end, Hawke departed on the expedition within the deep roads, and the group discovered the remains and ruins of the Valdesine Taig, and within they would discover bountiful hoards of lyrium. Delving deeper into these ruins, Hawke's expedition would discover an ancient dwarven artifact, a red lyrium idol. Falling to what might be assumed as avarice at the time, but what would later be revealed as corruption, Varric's brother Bartrand would end up making off with the idol as it began to drive him mad simply by the act of making contact with it. Hawke and the other members of the expedition would be trapped and had to find another way out of the deep roads. As luck would have it, Hawke and the expedition would stumble upon a massive bounty of wealth before they made their escape. But unfortunately, not all would be well. If Hawke's sibling joined them on the expedition, they would become sick with the taint of the Darkspawn. They would either need to be put out of their misery, or they would need to join the Grey Wardens with the help of Anders. To be a Grey Warden is to forever be haunted by the nightmares of the Darkspawn and the Archdemons, but it is also to know that one day the calling will occur, and they must head into the deep roads to die alone, fighting off the Darkspawn in one last charge. This would be the fate of any sibling that accompanied Hawke, and if they had stayed in Kirkwall, depending on who had survived, they would equally be changed, joining either the Templars or being forced into the Mage's Circle, depending on who they were. 3 years later, using the wealth acquired from the Deep Roads expedition, Hawke and their family would at least be able to repurchase their old family estate in the more prosperous part of Kirkwall known as Hightown. They gained yet more of a reputation within the city. But the situation had only continued to evolve within the city. Whilst it was a hotbed of slavers and criminals, whilst there was always tension between the Mages and the Templars, and whilst the crisis of Ferelden refugees was overwhelming, it was truly the tensions with the local Qunari heightened to a boiling point. There had been an unfortunate trend in recent days of theft from the Qunari, and it was driving their local military leader, or Arashok, to become more and more frustrated with the state of affairs in the city. This included articles included a poisonous gas referred to as Sar and a priceless item that the Arashok wasn't ready to name at the time, under the premise that it was believed to be the formula for Gadlock, Qunari black powder. There was also a priceless item that had been stolen from the Qunari, something the Arashok was not yet ready to name. Hawke would clear up some of these disturbances, but their efforts would be greatly waylaid by the xenophobia of Kirkwall, stoked in part by the Chantry and its local cleric, Sister Patrice. Despite this, the Viscount of Kirkwall would invite a Qunari delegate to parley so that the tensions might be eased, but the delegate and their entourage had been kidnapped. Upon further investigation, the Qunari had been kidnapped by a Templar named Sir Varnal, who had chained up and tortured the Qunari delegation. This would only inflame tensions with the Qunari even further, and Hawke was left with a decision to either fight the Qunari or fight Sir Varnal. Hawke would also be left with the choice of either telling the Viscount to burn the bodies or not to hide what had happened from the Arashok. Unfortunately, tensions would only rise further from here, regardless of any good intentions. Returning home, though, Hawke was led to another disturbing discovery. Their mother was missing. Following the trail that had been left behind would lead Hawke to the basement of the foundry where a blood mage named Quinton had performed unspeakable horrors. He had created a Frankenstein-esque homunculus from the body parts of several women. He called it his bride, and unfortunately, Hawke's mother, Leandra, was one of the victims. Quinton was slain by Hawke in the following combat, but there was nothing Hawke could do to save their mother. She died in the arms of her child, telling them that they had made her proud. Despite the abject horror of the personal tragedy that had befallen Hawke's family, there was little time for respite. Varric would ask Hawke to pick up the trail of his own family, namely Bartrand. His theft of the red lyrium idol was better explained by the investigation, as Hawke and their companions only discovered a shard of the idol within Bartrand's last known location. They also realized that he had been hearing voices from the corruptive influence of the idol, and had forced his servants to consume lyrium so that they could hear the voices too. The idol was nowhere to be found within Bartrand's property, and had supposedly been sold on to another buyer. This was not the last time it would cross Hawke's path. The tensions with the Qunari would continue to be inflamed further as the Viscount's son, Seamus, was looking to voluntarily convert to the practices of the Qun system. The Qun was not a religion, it was a way of life that the Viscount's son had chosen to voluntarily walk, as confirmed by the Arishok himself. However, the Arishok was sent a letter ahead of Hawke's arrival, asking him to meet with Seamus on neutral ground. Suspecting foul play on the part of the Chantry, who staunchly opposed anyone converting to the Qun, the Arishok asked Hawke to investigate. They discovered, in the Chantry itself, that Seamus had been murdered by Sister Patrice. After such a long series of poorly managed political escalations, the tension between the Qunari and the people of Kirkwall had risen to a fever pitch. The Arishok would command the Qunari to assault Kirkwall's Hightown and take hostages. Hawke arrived in time to see the Arishok toss the Viscount's head to the crowd below. The Arishok would demand the return of the sacred Qunari tome of Khoslan, which had been stolen by Isabella. They would also demand that she be surrendered into their custody. Failure to do so would mean direct conflict between Hawke and the Arishok. Regardless of the outcome, the majority of the remaining Qunari would leave the city. Hawke had dealt with the political situation with an unexpected degree of expedience, and so, when Meredith, the Knight Commander of the Templar Order, arrived, she would award them with the title of Champion of Kirkwall in recognition for their efforts. With no Viscount to lead the city, Knight Commander Meredith Stannard would effectively subsume the roles of governance into her office, and things in Kirkwall would begin to devolve quickly. The mages of Kirkwall's circle had always suffered more under the oppressive hand of the Templars than many in some other nations of Thedas, but as things continued to get worse within Kirkwall, the Templars' oppression would spread outward beyond simply the mages' circle. The increased regime of oppression was something that Meredith would see on the streets day by day, and soon, the oppression that the mages had felt for a long time was felt a little more keenly by all the citizens. Templar Knight Commander Meredith and First Enchanter Orsino of the Mages' Circle would repeatedly find themselves in arguments, and the Templars and mages were at risk of coming to blows. In the process of these arguments, even the members of the Mages and Templars would see a breakdown of loyalties within their own orders, with some of the Templars going so far as to kidnap people close to Hawke, be they their lover or remaining family members. In the end, just like with the Qunari, there was a breaking point that would one day be reached, but this time the consequences were not to be met on some distant horizon. When they did arrive, they would be immediate, far-reaching, and deadly. In truth, it all began with a petition from Anders. He stated that he needed the ingredients for a potion that would allow him and Justice to harmlessly separate, so they no longer needed to be bound together. Unfortunately for Hawke, this was a lie. Procuring the ingredients and allowing Anders to sneak into the Chantry would be Hawke's undoing in this regard. Even if Hawke never aided Anders, the result would be the same. Quietly, the pieces had been set in motion, and like the tumbling of stones that would lead to an avalanche, there was no way of stopping them. Later on, Knight Commander Meredith and the Circle's lead mage, Grand Enchanter Orsino, would again be discovered in Lowtown by Hawke. Yet again, Meredith was trying to enforce new draconian measures upon the mages of the Circle, accusing them of harboring blood mages. Before the conflict could be properly resolved, Anders would step forward, proclaiming that there would be no more compromises. Anders had watched his friends suffer the Rite of Tranquility and had seen the Templars push even further consequences on all those born arbitrarily with the talents of magic. He had seen these cruelties endured by so many of the Mage's Circle across the many lands that he had traveled, and had witnessed the oppression of the Chantry for too long. For Anders, and for justice, the time of compromises was behind them. Now was the moment to act. Anders would make his stand, and he would do so by detonating a massive explosion beneath the Chantry of Kirkwall, killing all those within. Shocking as it was to everyone in the moment, it would have been even worse for Hawke had they willingly assisted Anders. As the Chantry was torn asunder, and all those within perished, there must have been a dawning realization for Hawke. They were the ones who helped Anders sneak into the Chantry. They would have been accessory to this massacre. Even if they had never assisted Anders, the question of whether something could have been done to stop them would doubtless plague them for the rest of their days. As the devastation became apparent and everyone recovered from the shock, Knight Commander Meredith would immediately call for the Rite of Annulment, which would allow the Templars to put all the mages of the Circle to the sword, killing them all. This would force Hawke to either side with the Templar Order or with the mages. Hawke would also have to decide if Anders should live or die for his actions. Regardless of who Hawke supported in this moment, Orsino would feel backed into a corner, and would indeed resort to blood magic, even as he defended those within his order who had not. This would turn Orsino into a terrible monstrosity known as a Harvester. Meredith would also become hostile, turning mad and attempting to execute Hawke. As it turned out, Meredith was wielding a sword made of corrupted red lyrium. This was not just any red lyrium, though. This sword had been forged from the red lyrium idol that Bartrand had betrayed Hawke for all those years ago. Much like with Bartrand, it had driven Meredith insane, and she would be greatly empowered by the blade, attacking all those present. Even her fellow Templars were not sheltered from her rage. As Hawke struck her down, Meredith would call out to the Maker for more power, and in that moment, the blade shattered in Meredith's hand, and she turned into a statue. The Battle of Kirkwall might have been decided by the actions of Hawke and the death of Meredith, but the destruction of the Chantry by Anders would be a spark to rebellious kindling. All across Thedas, the long-oppressed mages of the Circles would begin to rise up against all their Templar masters. From central Orlais to distant Ferelden, the Battle of Kirkwall would be repeated across all the realms, and soon it erupted into a full-blown conflict, the Mage-Templar War. Chaos had been unleashed upon all of Thedas, save perhaps for Tevinter. And it would not be stopped at any point soon, not unless the price of thousands of lives was paid. Hawke's companions would disband as time went on, and in the end, the champion of Kirkwall would disappear. Eventually, Varric would be brought in for questioning on the nature of the whole tale by one Cassandra Pentagast, one of the Seekers of Truth. After learning the reality of what started the Mage-Templar War, she informed Varric that she was looking for the champion of Kirkwall, as they would supposedly be crucial for what was to come next. Meeting Leliana, Cassandra also noted that not only Hawke, but also the hero of Ferelden should be found. Both might have had a part to play in what came next, as calamity was starting to fall upon Thedas. There were darker forces building in the background, and ancient beings were set to awaken who would change the fate of the world. But for now, the Templar Mage War would consume the whole of the continent, until a fateful day when both sides would potentially sue for peace. But the time of the conclave was far from now. Before the war had even begun, before Kirkwall was plunged into the midst of a war it did not ask for, there was another strange adventure that would impact the future of Thedas. Hawke had become the target of a sect of a criminal cartel of dwarves known as the Carter. They were specifically seeking the blood of the Hawk. To understand why this was, Hawke and their companions would need to pursue them to the Vimark wastelands. Deep beneath a chasm, they discovered a Carter hideout, and further beneath that, they discovered a deeper series of chambers that appeared to be a prison, filled with Darkspawn. Deep within the prison, Hawke would discover the one who would bring doom to the world. Corypheus, the Conductor. This was the same Corypheus, the same Conductor who had been one of the 7 of the Magisters Sidereal, the first who had been spoken to by the old god Dumat in ages past, when the Tevinter Imperium was ascendant. He had been the first to conceive of the plan to enter into the Fade and to reach the Golden City so that he might ascend into godhood. Of course, this had not been what occurred. Instead, Corypheus had begun the Blights and had birthed the Darkspawn along with the other Magisters of the Sidereal. Corypheus had been imprisoned within this strange prison complex for a long time, and as it would turn out, Corypheus's jailer was Hawke's father. Corypheus had been using the magic of the Blight to manipulate those within the prison, including a pair of Grey Wardens known as Janica and Lorias. With the seals of the prison having been broken, Corypheus would be freed at last, but they would be brought into a direct confrontation with Hawke, and would be slain. Even with the defeat of Corypheus, it would appear that one of the remaining Wardens was possessed in the moment of the Magister's death. In this new flesh, Corypheus would be unleashed upon the world, ready to scheme and watch his plans unfold. They would do so in a moment of calamity and flame, and would spell doom for those who had already been left far too weary from war. The war between the Mages and the Templars that was initiated in Kirkwall would begin in the year of 930 Dragon, and would plunge the realms of Thedas into utter chaos. The Elysian Chantry, who had always placed harsh restrictions on the Mages in their lands, would be torn apart as Templars and Mages would begin to go rogue in pursuit of vengeance. In the throes of such a conflict, it was up to the leader of the Chantry, Divine Justinia V, to secure peace and unity for all the peoples of their faith. To assist her in this task, she knew that she would need to find individuals of utterly remarkable power, heroes who had defied the odds and emerged victorious. For this reason, she charged her left and right hands, Leliana and Cassandra, with searching for such talented individuals. Leliana was sent to search for the Warden Commander that had freed Ferelden, should they still live. Cassandra was sent to talk with Varric Tethras and ascertain the location of Hawke, the champion of Kirkwall, as well as the true nature of how the war had begun. Perhaps only these 2 talented individuals were capable of putting an end to the conflict. But as time went on, neither of these great heroes could be located, and with the nations of Thedas becoming weaker by the day, Divine Justinia V made the decision to call for a cessation of hostilities between the 2 sides. She called for a peace summit in the Frostback Mountains of the south. This conclave would be held in the same area as the town of Haven and the Temple of Sacred Ashes, the resting place of the Urn of Sacred Ashes and the remnants of Andraste herself. Holding the conclave at such a location was a prudent choice. On such sacred ground, neither side would be willing to invite conflict, and so in their hundreds the forces of the Mages and Templars began to congregate. But along with the many Mages and Templars, along with the Chantry's highest authority and the attending clergy, There was a dark presence that hung over this summit. The conclave would go forth, but it would not pan out as anyone expected. Forces were in motion that few could stop, save perhaps for one, the Herald, who at the time was a mere stranger to the rest of their companions. Their journey would begin with the ending of so many others. A massive explosion destroyed the temple and the surrounding mountainside, decimating the forces of the Templars and mages as green fire began to utterly engulf those who were taking the long path toward peace. Almost everyone who was consumed by the flames would perish, including Divine Justinia V herself. But there would be a survivor amongst the ruins, namely this stranger. They first regained consciousness in a swirling vortex of shadow and green fog. They stood and beheld a marvelous figure bathed in light. Desperately reaching for them, they discovered themselves returned to the mountain, only to quickly be captured by the forces of Leliana and Cassandra. The pair were quick to show the stranger what remained of the site of the temple, a gaping green maw leading straight into the Fade. They called it the Breach. Worse still, the expanding vortex corresponded to a green mark on the stranger's hand, a mark that would come to be known as the Anchor. It was causing remarkable pain, and was seemingly linked to the breach itself. The only course of action left available to Cassandra and the stranger was to explore this connection between the breach and the Anchor, and hope that by bringing the stranger to the site of the breach, they might be able to find a means of sealing it. The stranger would also encounter Varric Tethras, the former companion of the Hawk of Kirkwall, and a mysterious mage known as Solus, whose expertise on the lore of the ancient Elfen and the Fade was unparalleled. With the guidance of Solus in particular, the stranger would be able to close a nearby rift into the Fade using the Anchor, and with its power revealed, there was at last a chance to seal the breach. When they arrived at the breach site, the group of companions saw the remnants of the temple, and saw that they were littered with a substance, a red crystalline substance. It was lyrium. It had lost its typical blue hue. Much like the idol that Hawk had discovered in the Deep Roads, it ran a deep red. They also witnessed visions of a conversation held between the stranger, the Divine Justinia V, and some terrible figure cloaked in shadow. The stranger held no memory of the conversation. The questions of what had happened needed to wait. The original rift left in the wake of the explosion had to be sealed by the stranger, which, after considerable effort and passing out, they would manage to accomplish. When they next awoke, the stranger had been named the Herald of Andraste by the common people on account of how they closed the portal. Seizing on this opportunity, Cassandra would assert her authority to enact the final command of the Divine. She would reform the Old Inquisition, the organization that had morphed into the Templars. Their charge was a simple one. In the wake of the chaos that had erupted from the Conclave, they would stand as a bulwark of civilization and would bring order and hope to the world and all those within it. Within their ranks, the Herald would be supported by the likes of Cullen Rutherford, a former Knight Captain of the Kirkwall Templars, who would act as the Inquisition's military advisor. Leliana would leverage her vast network of contacts and act as the Inquisition's spy master. She would also reach out to a certain Josephine Montillier, an Antivan noble whose knowledge of Theodosian politics and the great game played by the Olesian aristocracy allowed her to serve as the Inquisition's ambassador. What was a less simple task was the political situation that the Inquisition would find itself in. Their immediate mission was one of closing the breach, but they had no reasonable means of doing so without assistance from either the mages or the Templars, and unfortunately, neither group was immediately willing to work with the Inquisition if it had not officially been recognized by the Chantry, which was thrown into the depths of a succession crisis and saw the Herald of Andraste as a threat to their power. As if to add insult to injury, the Herald was swiftly branded as a heretic. Even after traveling to the Orlesian capital of Val Royeaux, the Inquisition was spurned by both the Chantry and the Seekers of Truth, as politicking took precedence over protecting the people of the realm. From there, the Inquisition's hand was forced. Politics and the diplomatic line of possibility had led to nowhere. To close the breach, either the Templars or the Mages needed to help the Inquisition, but allying with either group would immediately make enemies of the other, and would also have further ripple effects throughout southern Thedas. The Mages and Templars would both be dealing with interlopers in their ranks. The Templars would be sundered by their addiction to lyrium, turning to the more powerful red lyrium and succumbing to its corruption, with those that did splintering into the so-called Red Templars. The Mages would be subject to the outside influence of the Venatori, a cult of Tevinter supremacists who would pull the Mages under their sway if the Inquisition did not intervene. Whichever faction the Herald and their companions assisted, the breach would be successfully closed with their powers combined with the Inquisition's own. Regardless of the road traveled and whose allegiance was earned, the Inquisition would discover that there were plans in motion at the whims of Corypheus, the Tevinter Magister who had entered the Fade so long ago in an attempt to seize divinity. This was discovered when he attacked the Inquisition's base at Haven with a high dragon. Much like the Red Templars, this once majestic creature had also succumbed to the corruption of the Red Lyrium. Whichever faction joined the Inquisition would find their corrupted adversaries subject to the plans of the Conductor, and would launch an all-out assault on the Inquisition at Haven so that Corypheus might acquire the power of the Anchor. Corypheus had attempted to steal the Anchor from the Herald with an ancient elven artifact referred to as the Orb of Destruction. Luckily for the Herald, the power of the Anchor was bound to them alone, and even though Corypheus tried, the process failed. With some earlier quick thinking as the village of Haven was being overrun, the Herald had used a trebuchet to bring down an avalanche and bury the advancing forces. Corypheus might have been buried too, if it wasn't for the corrupted dragon at his side that whisked him away to safety. As the survivors fled from the wreckage of their previous headquarters, Solus informed the Inquisition of an ancient nearby fortress known as the Skyhold. The journey through the mountains was perilous, but with their arrival and after they had claimed the fort officially, the Herald of Andraste would be given a new title, the Inquisitor, the grand leader of their order and the champion that would see Thedas through this darkness. In order to stop Corypheus, though, the Inquisition would need to intervene in the events unfolding in neighboring Orlais. The Herald and their companions had learned of a plot to assassinate the Orlesian Empress, a move which would only sow more chaos and enable more of Corypheus's plans. Varek also introduced the Inquisitor to an old friend with important information on Corypheus. Hawke had emerged. They would point out that the Grey Wardens had also seemingly been corrupted by Corypheus, and that if they wanted to try and solve that further complication, they would need to head to Crestwood to meet with one of Hawke's allies amongst the Grey Wardens. After meeting with Hawke's ally, be it Alistair, Stroud, or Loghain MacTier, depending on the choices of previous heroes, the group would be informed of what had befallen the Grey Wardens. They would learn the truth of Corypheus's secret, that had allowed him to survive his brush with death at the hands of the champion of Kirkwall. But there were far darker things afoot. Due to machinations by Venatori agents under Corypheus's command, the Grey Wardens had all begun to hear the calling in unison. Normally this would only happen after a set amount of time with the Darkspawn corruption in their veins, but all of the Wardens were now hearing it at once, and they feared that their order would be utterly eliminated, leaving the world defenseless against the Darkspawn of the potential 6th and 7th Blights whenever they might occur. This would have left the world in a dire state, and so to counter this, they had enacted a desperate gambit, a gambit that happened to serve Corypheus's purposes perfectly. The Grey Wardens would use blood magic to summon an army of demons to march upon the deep roads. With this army at their beck and call, they would discover the remaining old gods and slay them before they could be turned into archdemons. Of course, the real purpose of the army would be for Corypheus to decide, and once it had been summoned, the Wardens would be disposed of. Hawke's Warden ally had objected to the plan, and for such objections the Warden commander Clarel branded them a traitor, and so they fled. The Inquisition, Hawke, and their Warden ally were all led toward an old Tevinter ruin. There they saw that the rituals of the Wardens were already being conducted, and demons were already being bound to Warden mages. What the Wardens didn't know was that as the rituals were overseen by Magister Livius Erimond, Corypheus's Venatori puppet, the mages and demons would both be left at the whims of the conductor himself. After clashing with the Inquisition, the Wardens were forced to retreat to the Adamant Fortress. Pursuing them, the Inquisition confronted the Warden commander as she was about to summon a powerful nightmare demon, one that had originally been used to amplify the false calling and convince the Wardens that they needed to conduct their desperate plan. Before they could talk down the Warden commander, Erimond intervened and summoned Corypheus's corrupted dragon to kill her and the Inquisitor. The Warden commander was mortally wounded, and the Inquisitor was sent falling into the abyss with their companions. In a moment of quick thinking, the Inquisitor opened a rift into the Fade. Instead of falling to their deaths, they fell into the realm of dreams. Within the Fade, they discovered a figure of strange light, the same figure that the Inquisitor had seen at the start of their journey. As it happened, the voice that everyone had heard in the breach, that all had assumed to be Andraste, was actually the voice of Divine Justinia V, who had sacrificed herself in the explosion at the conclave that formed the breach. It was her remnant soul that the Inquisitor had seen within the Fade as the breach was created. She would assist the Inquisitor in escaping the Fade and restoring their memories. In the process, it was revealed that Corypheus had used mind-controlled Warden mages to infiltrate the conclave with the intent of sacrificing Justinia. By doing this, Corypheus would have unlocked the elven artifact he held, the Orb of Destruction, and he would have been given the power of the Anchor for his own use. In doing so, Corypheus would be able to enter the Fade and the Black City, and take the absent throne of the Maker as a god. But as it happened, the Inquisitor had been there by pure chance, and as Justinia had knocked the orb out of Corypheus's hands, the Inquisitor had picked it up. It was this intervention that had given the Inquisitor their anchor, and had brought discord to all of Corypheus's plans. After escaping the Fade, the group was once again faced with the Nightmare Demon, but thanks to the spirit of Justinia and the sacrifice of either Hawke or their Warden ally, they were able to escape. The Wardens that remained would either be instructed to rebuild alongside the Inquisition, or they would be banished from Orlais for their transgressions. Whether Hawke or their Warden ally survived, they would make their way to the Grey Warden's ancient fortress in the southern Anderfels to inform the First Warden of what had occurred. Despite the terrible power that Corypheus was marshalling to his side, the Inquisitor and their forces also needed to ensure that there was stability within the realms of Thedas so that Corypheus's next moves could be resisted. With this in mind, it was clear that the Inquisition would need to address the wider Orlesian civil war and prevent the greatest of the southern kingdoms of Thedas from falling into chaos. Doing this would mean responding to the discovered plot to assassinate the Orlesian Empress, and that would take the Inquisition to the Dalish lands and the old second elven capital of Halam Sharal. The Empress's cousin was holding a ball to facilitate peace between the Empress and her principal rival in the civil war, the Grand Duke Gaspard de Chalon. As it turned out, the Winter Palace was also home to a number of other notable figures. Briala, Empress Celine's elven spy master and secret lover, was working to form a third faction of rebelling elves within the Empire. The Empress had also picked up a rather familiar face as her new advisor on all things occult. Morrigan, the daughter of the Witch of the Wilds, Flemeth. As it would happen, the palace was also filled with agents of both Briala's elven insurrection and the Tevinter Venatori. The Inquisition would need to navigate their way safely through the knives, both metaphorical and literal, that hid in every corner of the Winter Palace. However, their ultimate objective was stability for Orlais, and in the process of achieving this, they could either depose the Empress, reveal Gaspard's plot, install Briala as the real authority behind the throne, or force an uneasy truce between all three groups. Regardless of the outcome, Corypheus's plans would be halted, and Morrigan would be appointed as the Orlesian liaison at Skyhold. By this point in the Inquisitor's tale, it was the year 942 Dragon, and the Inquisition was well established and ready to take the fight directly to Corypheus. His armies might be swollen by the remaining Venatori and Red Templars, he might have had his dragon and the Orb of Destruction, but there had to be a way to end his threat, no matter the cost. Those forces that did remain loyal to Corypheus had located and marched upon the elven ruins in the Arbor Wilds. Morrigan stated that it was likely that Corypheus was looking for an intact Eluvian, one of the Elfen gateways that connected to each other through the subdimensional space known as the Crossroads. Fearing that if Corypheus reached the Crossroads, he could enter the Fade, Morrigan and the Inquisitor chose to act. The armies at the Inquisition's disposal would descend upon the Arbor Wilds and took the fight directly to Corypheus's forces. As the Inquisition entered the ruins, there was another force of elves that had joined the battle with the forces of Corypheus. The Inquisition faced the choice of a direct confrontation or a more steady and deft approach. If they followed the ancient elven traditions and performed certain rituals within the ruins, they gained favor with these ancient elves that guarded the temple, the so-called Sentinels. Ignoring these rituals, particularly to the chagrin of Solus, would mean facing off against both Corypheus's forces and the Sentinels to take the more direct path through. As the battles progressed, the Inquisition's members would discover what Corypheus sought, an artifact called the Well of Sorrows. Drinking from it would supposedly grant one the knowledge of all the ancient elves, which had been collected over thousands of years in secret. But if Corypheus drank from it, he would also gain control over the temple's Eluvian, which he would be able to use to cross over into the Crossroads. Tearing down their barriers would then allow him to enter the Fade, and once there he would be able to enter the Black City and perhaps truly become a god. Racing Corypheus's general to the Eluvian, the Inquisitor and their forces learned that to drink from the Well of Sorrows would leave that individual bound to the will of the dead elven god Mythal. But it was also the only way to deny Corypheus access to the Fade, and so either the Inquisitor or Morrigan would have to drink from the well to deny power to their adversary. The Inquisitor and their forces fled through the Eluvian, which linked with another gate that Morrigan had brought to Skyhold. Having been denied his power, Corypheus promptly abandoned his forces and fled with his dragon. From there, he had but one final option. There would be no compromise. Corypheus was determined to either rule over the world or leave it in ruin. As they fled, Morrigan and the Inquisitor met another familiar face. Flemeth. They discovered that she was a vessel of what remained of the murdered elven god Mythal, the Mother. Whoever had drunk from the well was bound to Flemeth's will, but Flemeth also granted them a power which they could use to defeat Corypheus at last. The power over dragons. By either transforming into or controlling a high dragon, the red lyrium corrupted dragon created by Corypheus could be challenged directly and possibly destroyed. With this power, Corypheus would be momentarily left vulnerable and might be killed outright. The power that presented itself here arrived just in time, as Corypheus had begun to enact his final plan. He had returned to the original site of the breach. He used the power of the Orb of Destruction to tear it open once again, and challenged the Inquisitor and their forces to one final battle. If the Inquisition failed, Corypheus would enter the Fade and ascend to godhood in the Black City. But with the newfound power of the Inquisition, the power over dragons, Corypheus's corrupted beast was finally challenged and slain. Thus the Conductor was left vulnerable. Corypheus lost his grip on the orb, and the Inquisitor would once again snatch it from his grasp. They used it, and the power of the anchor, to permanently seal the breach. After having done so, they banished Corypheus's spirit into the Fade, destroying his body. In that last cataclysmic moment, the war had been won. Thedas had once again been saved. It should have been a moment of great and universal celebration, but one amongst the Inquisition's number was less than elated. In the aftermath of the battle, Solus retrieved what was left of the Orb of Destruction and stated strange words. He stated his disappointment that he was unable to prevent the irreparable damage that had been done. He bid the Inquisition farewell and left without another word. Later, as the rest of Thedas began to rebuild, Solus would meet with Flemeth. The two did not meet as adversaries, but spoke instead with the familiarity of old friends. Their conversation revealed the first facet of Solus's true nature and of his treachery. Flemeth revealed that it was Solus who had given the Orb of Destruction to Corypheus and chastised him for his reckless action. Solus retorted, saying that it was necessary as his own powers were still too weak after his long slumber. The two began to apologize and drew close into an embrace. But as this happened, Solus stated that the people still needed him. He absorbed the power of Mythal that resided within Flemeth, and began to enact the next stage of his plan. But the most crucial detail of this meeting was not the happenings of it, but the title with which Flemeth addressed Solus. Dreadwolf. Solus, as it turned out, had been Fen'Harel all along, the ancient elven trickster god of the Evanuris, the creator of the Veil, the one who had banished his fellow gods for Mythal's death, the reason for the quickening that stole immortality from his people, the one whose name all surviving Elfen cursed. And this would not be the last that the Inquisitor would see of them. 2 years after Corypheus's defeat, the Inquisitor would follow a trail of Qunari spies who had planned to assassinate the southern rulers of Thedas as a preamble to a takeover by the Qunari. Chasing the leader of this plot, the Vidasala, the Inquisitor would eventually pass through a series of alluvions and found themselves standing before the familiar face of Solus himself. The Qunari leader was face to face with the ancient Elfen being and was instantly turned to stone. For Solus, secrecy was no longer of use as a tool, so in that moment he revealed the truth. He confirmed that he was indeed the Dreadwolf, and that when he had woken from the Uthanera, his long slumber, he had been disgusted by what Thedas had become. In the time of his long slumber, after creating the Veil, there had been nothing but suffering for those that he cared for. The plight of the Elfen people, the same plight that he had started a rebellion to prevent, had only been worsened by humanity and their continuation of the Evanuris' old ways of slavery. Even as the power of the Tevinter Imperium had waned, the elves still lived in alienages in the southern kingdoms, and slavery was still a means of power. Solas revealed what he believed would be his ultimate solution. Long ago, he had banished the Evanuris into the Fade and created the Veil to prevent their return. He had done so at the ruin of elven society. Now, he would restore the old world at the cost of the one before him. He would tear down what he had created so long ago. He would destroy the Veil. This would result in countless demons and spirits being unleashed upon the whole of Thedas. Untold destruction would occur in every kingdom, and millions might die. But Solas's path was now set, and he believed it was his fate to right his wrong from millennia ago. With this, Solas would sever the arm of the Inquisitor, the arm that had been tainted by the Anchor. This would save their life, but would leave them terribly wounded. With this, Solas fled through an alluvion and left the Inquisitor to their fate. The doom of all the world had been made clear, and the agents of the Inquisition had been given all the warning they might possibly get. The Dreadwolf was on the move, and if his plan succeeded, it would lead to the ruination of all that was. This was a threat even greater perhaps than the Blights. Instrumental though it had been, the Inquisition was no longer the right organization to face Solas. Its leadership was faced with the choice of either reforming to serve the newly elected Divine Victoria or to disband entirely. But more importantly, Solas knew the members of the Inquisition, and in doing so was able to counter their strengths and exploit their weaknesses. It would now be the task of a new band of heroes to take on the Dreadwolf and save the world from the destruction that the Fade might unleash if the Veil was to be torn down at the hands of Fen-Harel. In the aftermath of Solas's betrayal, those that know of his plans have been holding their breath in anticipation of his next move. But blissfully ignorant of the doom that approaches, the world of Thedas has kept on turning. Solas has kept moving and has cultivated his network of agents even further. His activities are much as one might expect, stealing artifacts of power, disrupting the networks of those who might oppose him, freeing elven slaves. For almost 10 years now, he has been working towards his ultimate objective, tearing down the Veil he created so long ago and restoring the old world that elves once used to rule. Those that wish to oppose the Dreadwolf will need to gather allies from places further afield than have ever previously been considered. With that in mind, before embarking on your adventures, there are some more things you should probably know. With his control over the entire Illuvian network, Solas has the advantage of unparalleled mobility. This means that finding him will be an endeavor requiring agents across all the known world and alliances with powerful organizations in every land of Thedas. These are just some of the organizations that you might want to acquaint yourself with. Firstly, one must consider Ravane. Hailing from these lands means that one might be assumed to be associated with the infamous pirates of Lomeran, or to be one of the many Ravani who believe in their polytheistic faith, as opposed to any denomination of Andrastianism. As one of the farthest reaches of Thedas, this land's customs have always stood apart from the rest. Its society is predominantly matriarchal, in stark contrasts to the overlords of Tevinter that once ruled here. Magic can also be practiced more freely in Ravane, with the Ravani Mage's Circle mostly being created as a means of appeasing Chantry doctrine. Mages are seldom confined to its walls, and are often given training to become seers, a highly respected position which involves communion with the spirits of old. Ravane's history, however, speaks to their tenacity. Formerly a part of the old Tevinter Imperium, then conquered by the Qunari, the Ravani have stood firm against countless foes before. There are many organizations that exemplify this spirit of survival against all odds, but the Lords of Fortune might be one of the best. This band of treasure hunters has been known to retrieve valuables and loot from ancient ruins and long-forgotten caves, whilst facing down the many dangers of the old world. But in truth, seeking bounties from lost treasures is only one facet of the organization's operation. They also offer services as monster slayers and as personal bodyguards for those who might seek out treasure for themselves. Some are even capable infiltrators with skills in social manipulation, such as the ability to confidently alter their accents. Though originally of Ravane, the Lords of Fortune are known to accept contracts in fields afar, from the Tevinter Imperium to the Free Marches. Given their talent as treasure hunters, no locale is seen as too treacherous to traverse. The Lords of Fortune may even have left footsteps in the stranger reaches of the forests of Arlathan and the dwarven deep roads. But for every moment where opposing Solus might involve exploring ancient ruins, there will be another where the arena of politics and intrigue must be entered. All nations in Thedas have some history of political machinations, be it Ferelden's great customs of the Landsmeet, or the tit-for-tat of sabotage that Orlesians undergo when taking part in the game. But amongst all the nations of Thedas, few are as politically deft as the natives of Antiva. In the past, the Antivan nobility held their stations through political marriages of convenience or through their history as a nation of mercenaries and pirates. According to official histories, the royal line of Antiva has not been broken for over 2,000 years. This might present a veneer of power and authority, or even stability, but it is mostly a veil that obscures the true nature of power within this nation. Since times dating back to the early appearances of the Andrastian faith within Antiva, there has been a different power behind this nation, a force that has meant that few besides the Qunari and the Darkspawn have been willing to attack this nation for fear of the consequences. For where Antiva lacks a standing army, it instead has the Crows. This infamous guild of assassins has long been a means of acquiring political power within Antiva and beyond. On more than one occasion, an Antivan royal has been assassinated, and it has been inferred that the Crows were the ones responsible. Crows are not bound by many constraints, but once a contract with them has been initiated, their loyalty to that contract is legendary. Crows seldom, if ever, break those contracts, even under the pressure of torture. Contracts are handled by the 8 masters within the Crows, who are also known as Talons. When a contract is accepted, the Talons will then dispatch their Crow agents to carry out the contract to its precise, exacting end. Failure to kill one's mark or to accomplish a task will result in the Crow forfeiting their life. This has only heightened the reputation of the Antivan Crows, and ensured that anyone daring enough to join them is rendered sharp as their blades, swift as the motion of the cut to a throat. To have a Crow fighting by your side is to hold power over the lives of your foes. But the oldest power in the realm is one that is found in ancient places. In the search for Solus, there is an inevitable need for those who have a great understanding of these ancient places, and nowhere is more ancient than the realms of the ancient elves of Arlathan, where the magics of the Fade run rampant. In this respect, as one searches for knowledge of these places and peoples, one might initially turn to the scholars of the Chantry or the mages of their circles. In this instance, though, it might well be more helpful to have less of an academic understanding and more of a practical one. In this respect, there is only one organization that will serve such a purpose: the Veil Jumpers. These intrepid explorers are based in a region of great interest to Solus and those wishing to oppose him, namely the ancient elven forest capital of Arlathan. This ragtag group of explorers formed in an attempt to restore order to the ancient forest and its ruins in the wake of continual strange anomalies that were starting to appear. Though necessarily academics by trade, their knowledge of ancient elven artifacts and the magic of old Elfanan is nearly unmatched. Perhaps only Solus knows more. Whilst they were founded by elves, there is no limitation to any who might join their membership, based on species. All who are bold enough to explore the ruins of Old Arlathan are welcome in the cohort of the Veil Jumpers. This is all the more important as the peril of venturing into such a place is not to be underestimated. Arlathan has long been steeped in ancient magics, and those that tread within would do best not to disturb the brittle boundaries between this world. The Veil Jumpers will be willing allies in a place where no laws can be found, but such places are rare within Thedas and its many powerful kingdoms. Whilst those who fight against Solus might find some governments willing to render assistance, there are others who will make efforts to prevent any encroachment on their own power. Few are as authoritarian as the rulers of Tevinter. Be they the clergy of the Imperial Chantry, the zealous fanatics of the Venatori, or even the ruling Archon, the instinct of the leadership of Tevinter is to cull dissent within their own society, and has been a constant since the days of the ancient Imperium. But there are those who would stand against oppression in all its forms, no matter the danger, even in the heart of Tevinter's empire. Freeing enslaved peoples, defying draconian laws of the Senate, or even just fighting for a better tomorrow is a hard cause for any within the Imperium. Nevertheless, it is a cause that has been taken up by the so-called Shadow Dragons. A group of rebel insurgents based in Tevinter, the Shadow Dragons aim to stand against the Imperium's corrupt ruling class and as a bulwark against the injustice that they force upon the ordinary people of Tevinter. Within the vast Imperial capital of Minrathous, the Shadow Dragons operate in secrecy out of select neighborhoods. In particular, the Shadow Dragons count themselves amongst the common enemies of the Venatori cultists. The Tevinter supremacists have aimed for a long time to restore the Imperium to its former glory, regardless of whatever they might need to accomplish in the process. In this capacity alone, the Shadow Dragons may prove to be a crucial ally within the hostile territories of the Imperium, as they are one of the few groups that has been persistently able to resist and even wound the Venatori. Of course, unconventional allies will be needed in every corner of Thedas, but there are perhaps few allies more unconventional than those that one might find within Nevarra. It is within this strange culture and their unique approach to death and the practices surrounding it that one can find power. In this regard, there are few in Nevarra that hold power beyond that of the Mortalitasi, a secretive order of mages whose power over Nevarra is perhaps greater than that of any other mage in any other nation, save for Tevinter. Known for their curious obsession with death, there are a variety of differing customs practiced in the Mortalitasi ranks. Chief amongst those is the mummification of the dead, which stands in stark contrast to the other nations of Thedas, who generally cremate the remains of the fallen. The mages of the Mortalitasi believe that when a soul of the dead enters the Fade, the process naturally displaces a spirit that once dwelled within. According to the Mortalitasi, a mummified corpse will provide a safe host in which such a spirit might reside. It is perhaps unsurprising that some of the Nevarran mages that are found within the different orders of the Mortalitasi practice necromancy, the art of summoning spirits from the Fade that are drawn to death so that they might fight on the mage's behalf. Amongst the ranks of the Mortalitasi, the most respected protectors of those spirits that slumber within the great necropolis are the Mournwatch. They have been given complete authority over the funerary dead within the Grand Necropolis, and as a result, their power is to be respected by all, be they amongst the living or not. The current political climate in Nevarra has become strained with accusations that the current ruler of the Pentagast dynasty, Marcus Pentagast, has become a puppet of the Mortalitasi. As a result, multiple competing claimants to the throne have risen to attempt to make plays for power. Chaos of this nature will act as it did in Ferelden during the Fifth Blight, and will only weaken the Nevarran response to the horrors that might be unleashed by worse actors. If the veil is torn down, they will find themselves particularly at risk. It is perhaps only with the elite of the Mournwatch that one might bring the full might of Navarra to bear, all while acquiring the power and aid of the dead. And of course, if one is going to face the greatest horrors of the world, then one needs to contract those who have long stood in its defense. The Grey Wardens and their apolitical order are another source of potential power against the horrors that Solus might unleash. Whilst they're known for fighting Darkspawn and for being the only ones with the power to kill the archdemons of the Blights, the Wardens will still sally forth to fight monsters of any kind that threaten Thedas. Though they maintain fortresses throughout many of the territories of Thedas, their official headquarters can be found in the most southern reaches of the Anderfels, in the ancient fortress of Weishaupt. In the days of old, this used to be a great stable of the noble griffins and a fortress manned by thousands of wardens. But as time has gone on, and as the wardens have become more decentralized, this fortress has begun to fall into disrepair. Though the position of First Warden no longer holds the same authorities it used to, their seat of power can still be found here. Therefore, any official attempt to recruit the Grey Wardens into the defense of Thedas is likely to start here in Weishaupt. Though the splendor of the fortress and the prestige of the Wardens might have dulled in the years since the Fifth Blight, within the fortress one might still find significant power. Ancient armories and libraries contain priceless relics and deadly weapons that one might use to push back the horrors of the world, be they Darkspawn or not. This includes the armaments and armor of the old elven champion of the Fourth Blight, the Warden Garahel. And yet, it is within the dedication of each Warden that the greatest asset against the Dreadwolf might be found. For within any true Warden, there is a lifelong commitment to the duty of protecting others. The Darkspawn blood that they each ingest in the joining means that their lives will be dedicated to service, and that no matter the circumstances, they will die fighting the horrors of the world. Be it in a battlefield on the surface, fighting against demons, or deep beneath the earth, facing the final horrors they shall see in their life as they face the inevitable calling. No matter what, Solus is out there. To face him, you will need to find new companions to fill your new cadre. This will be the Veilguard, and with every member amongst its ranks, there will be a story to be told. It's an eclectic bunch, from elfen to dwarves, from necromantic mages to elite assassins. Each member of the Veilguard is uniquely qualified to take on the impending battle to save all of Thedas. The storm you'll face is a monumental one, and the harsh reality of that storm is that choices in this war will have consequences. You might not be able to keep all your allies content, you might even hold their lives in your hands. Your choices will go on to form ripples throughout the Veilguard's members and the rest of Thedas. Some relationships may deepen, others may tangle, some may fray and fall by the wayside. Be sure to keep as many of your companions close as you can though. Every single one of them will be able to guide you through different parts of Thedas. Whether you're exploring the ancient elfin ruins of Old Arlathan or the darkest reaches of the Dwarven Deep Roads, you'll want to avail yourself of experts who know the land and your foes. And every location from the Tevinter capital of Minrathaus to the province of Ravain will present new stories to experience and mysteries to uncover. And at the heart of it all, there's you, the Rook, the hero that shall define this story. Like the Warden of Ferelden, the Hawk of Kirkwall, and the Inquisitor before you, your tale will be your own to tell. Whether you're a mage, warrior, or rogue, whether you're a human, a Qunari, a dwarf, or an elf, you'll be able to use an expansive arsenal of talents to combat the dangers arising from Solus's choice. You'll be able to fight your way, to make the choices you want, and to be able to become the hero you want to be. The world ahead presents many dangers, But in overcoming those dangers, you'll forge your own unique rook into the hero that all of Thedas needs. For now is the time to face the Dreadwolf. Now is the time to stop the plot of Fen-Harel. It is the year 953 of the Dragon Age. It is the year where the world will be torn asunder. It is the time of the ascension of the Veilguard.